My son-in-law thought I was just a broke old man living on Social Security. He had absolutely no idea I was a retired four-star general, pulling a $39,000 monthly pension plus private defense dividends. He invited me to a lavish Christmas dinner with his wealthy parents. I wore my oldest, most frayed surplus coat because I wanted to see exactly how they treated someone they considered a nobody. Then his father quietly slid a white envelope across the mahogany table. 3 minutes later, I walked out into the freezing night and made a single phone call that would systematically destroy his entire bloodline. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to arrogant people who completely underestimated your true power. The wind cutting off Lake Michigan was brutal that December evening. It whipped through the downtown streets, rattling the street lamps and driving pedestrians into the nearest warm doorways. The cold meant absolutely nothing to me. I had survived 3 grueling winter deployments in the Korengal Valley, where the ice froze your eyelashes to your rifle scope, and the wind felt like shattered glass against your skin. A brisk Chicago night was just a gentle breeze. I stood outside the heavy glass doors of Le Petit Chateau. It was the kind of ridiculously overpriced restaurant where the menus lacked price tags and the valet parked nothing cheaper than a Porsche or a Bentley. I wore my olive drab field jacket. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, stained with old engine oil, and faded from years of hard use. I could have worn my bespoke Italian suit. I could have bought the entire restaurant the building it sat in and the city block surrounding it with a single phone call. But I chose the old jacket for a very specific reason. I was conducting tactical reconnaissance. You learn everything you need to know about a man by watching how he treats someone he believes is beneath him. I pulled open the heavy brass doors and stepped into the warm, dimly lit foyer. The air smelled of roasted truffles and expensive cedar wood. My son-in-law Brian was waiting near the hostess stand. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost a month of a teacher's salary, paired with a flashy gold watch designed to demand attention. The moment his eyes landed on my jacket, his face contorted in absolute disgust. He actually took a physical step back, as if poverty was a contagious disease. He checked over his shoulder, his eyes darting around the room to ensure none of the other wealthy patrons were associating him with me. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He stepped forward, grabbed my elbow with a tight, aggressive grip, and hissed that I was embarrassing him. He told me I looked like a vagrant and that I was going to ruin the most important dinner of his year. I simply looked down at his hand gripping my sleeve. I stared at his fingers until the silence became unbearable for him. He slowly released his grip, swallowing hard. Brian led me into the main dining room without another word. My daughter Rachel sat at a large circular booth next to a towering, heavily decorated Christmas tree. She gave me a fragile, nervous smile that immediately put me on high alert. Across from her sat Brian's parents, Stephen and Patricia. They looked like a living magazine advertisement for new money and old arrogance. Stephen wore a silk cravat and a custom velvet blazer. Patricia was draped in heavy gold jewelry that clinked loudly with her every movement. Brian cleared his throat and introduced me as Rachel's father. I stepped forward and extended my right hand toward Stephen. Stephen stared at my calloused hand. He let his eyes travel up my arm, taking in the frayed cuffs and the worn fabric of my coat. He flatly refused to take my hand. He picked up his crystal wine glass instead and took a slow, deliberate sip. Patricia let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed over the soft jazz playing in the background. She loudly asked if I had walked all the way from the downtown homeless shelter or if I had managed to scrounge up enough coins for the bus. I lowered my hand and maintained my posture. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. In my military career, I negotiated with ruthless warlords and interrogated hardened insurgents. I knew exactly how to handle arrogant civilians. Stephen snapped his fingers at a passing waiter treating the young man like a dog. He ordered the staff to add a chair at the absolute far end of the table. He explicitly stated he did not want my dirty coat brushing against Patricia's silk dress. The waiter looked deeply apologetic, but complied with the demand. They isolated me at the very edge of the booth, completely cutting me off from Rachel. I sat down in total silence. I unfolded my napkin and placed it on my lap. The operation had officially begun. I was no longer a father attending a holiday dinner. I was a general evaluating a hostile force. The dinner progressed into a masterclass of psychological abuse and blatant narcissism. Stephen and Patricia dominated the entire conversation. They loudly bragged about their newly renovated summer home in the Hamptons, their exclusive country club memberships, and their recent luxury yacht trip to Monaco. They spoke over everyone, raising their voices to ensure the neighboring tables heard exactly how wealthy and important they were. Brian puffed out his chest, eager to impress his father. He boasted about his recent promotion to senior vice president at his investment firm. He claimed he was closing million-dollar corporate deals before his morning coffee. He painted a picture of a man who controlled the world. Then Brian deliberately turned his attention to me. He raised his voice just as the waiter stepped close to pour our water. He claimed loudly enough for the staff to hear that he was currently paying the rent for my tiny rundown apartment out of the goodness of his heart. He said he simply could not let his wife's father freeze on the streets during the winter, even if it drained his own hard-earned savings. Rachel flinched. She looked down at her plate, her face turning pale. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. Her hands trembled violently in her lap. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to defend me or correct his outrageous lie. Before she could form a word, Brian shot her a cold, controlling glare that instantly silenced her. She bit her lip and stared at her hands. I methodically cut my steak and chewed my food. I did not correct his ridiculous lie. I owned my luxury penthouse apartment outright. In fact, my real estate portfolio owned the entire residential building he thought I rented a closet in. But I remained silent because I was gathering vital intelligence. I observed Brian's body language meticulously. He leaned forward, aggressively puffing his chest out toward Rachel, yet his eyes constantly darted toward his father, seeking validation and approval. It was the exact posture of a coward trying to project false authority. He was a weak, pathetic man, using financial leverage and emotional intimidation to terrorize my daughter. He was breaking her spirit piece by piece to maintain his own fragile ego. Patricia noticed my calm demeanor and clearly despised it. She leaned across the table with a malicious glint in her heavily made-up eyes. She reached for the butter dish, extending her arm entirely too far. With a deliberate, calculated flick of her wrist, she knocked her full glass of Merlot directly onto my sleeve. The dark red liquid splashed across the table and soaked deep into the faded green fabric of my coat. Rachel gasped aloud and jumped up with her linen napkin, her eyes wide with panic. Brian yanked Rachel back down into her seat by her wrist. He commanded her through gritted teeth not to make a scene and embarrass them. Patricia offered a fake, theatrical gasp of apology. She reached into her designer leather purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and tossed it onto my dinner plate. She told me to buy myself a hot meal and maybe some cheap laundry detergent from the corner store. I looked at the soggy bill resting on top of my mashed potatoes. I did not blink. I memorized every single detail of their smug, victorious faces. Halfway through the main course, Rachel excused herself to use the restroom. She needed a moment to compose herself, her eyes shining with unshed tears that she desperately tried to hide from her husband. The moment she disappeared around the corner and out of earshot, the atmosphere at the table shifted drastically. The fake, boastful smiles vanished, replaced by cold, hard stares. Stephen leaned heavily against the table, invading my personal space. He reached into the inner pocket of his velvet blazer and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. He slid the envelope across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of my plate, right next to the wine-soaked $20 bill. Stephen did not mince his words. He dropped the aristocratic facade and spoke with the blunt cruelty of a street thug in a suit. He stated that my presence in their city was a massive, unforgivable embarrassment to their family's social standing. He said Brian was destined for elite corporate circles, and having a broke, ragged father-in-law showing up at holidays was severely damaging his executive image. Stephen tapped a manicured finger against the envelope. He told me there was a certified cashier's check inside for exactly $10,000. He laid out his demands with the arrogance of a dictator giving terms of surrender. I was to take the money tonight. I was to pack up my miserable belongings by the weekend. I was to move to a cheap retirement community in another state far away from their pristine lives. I was to change my phone number. I was to cut all contact with my daughter permanently. He called it a highly generous severance package for a failed father. I looked down at the pristine white envelope. I did not touch it yet. I ran the numbers in my head with clinical precision. $10,000 was roughly what my military pension and private defense consulting dividends generated in a single working week. They honestly believed this paltry sum was a life-changing fortune for me. They believed money could sever a bloodline and purchase my absolute submission. Brian leaned back in his leather chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He smirked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. He told me I better take the money tonight and run. He said a pathetic, washed-up old man like me would never see a sum like that again for the rest of my miserable existence. He promised to make Rachel's life a living hell if I refused the deal. He threatened to divorce her, drag her through a grueling legal battle, and leave her with absolutely nothing. He was openly holding my daughter hostage for my compliance. I did not yell. I did not flip the table or throw my drink in his arrogant face. Uncontrolled anger is a severe liability on the battlefield. I picked up the envelope. I neatly folded it in half and placed it securely into the breast pocket of my stained coat. I looked directly into Stephen's eyes with the absolute terrifying calm of a commanding officer authorizing a lethal drone strike. I told him I understood the arrangement perfectly. I stood up from the table, my movements smooth and deliberate. I did not wait for Rachel to return. Saying goodbye would only cause a scene and compromise the extraction phase of my operation. I offered a brief, rigid nod to Patricia and walked out of the dining room. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders squared, and my steps measured. As I reached the coat check near the front entrance, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Brian. The message read that if I breathed a single word of this bribe to Rachel, he would freeze all their joint bank accounts and throw her out on the street by morning. He warned me to be gone by Monday, or he would destroy her. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors into the freezing, relentless Chicago night. The icy wind battered my face, but I felt a deep, burning heat rising in my chest. I reached into my inner pocket and bypassed my standard civilian phone. I pulled out a pristine, encrypted satellite smartphone. I dialed a highly secure number that few people on Earth possessed. The line picked up on the first ring. A sharp, disciplined voice answered immediately. It was Michael. Michael was a former military intelligence officer who served under my direct command during the bloodiest days in Fallujah. He now ran my elite private security and forensic accounting firm. I did not exchange pleasantries. I gave him a direct, undeniable order. I told him I was holding a cashier's check from a man named Stephen. I read him the routing numbers and the specific account details printed on the face of the check. I ordered Michael to deploy his entire cyber division immediately. I wanted a full military-grade forensic trace on that bank account. I wanted to know every single cent coming in and going out for the last 5 years. I wanted Brian and his parents financially dissected, analyzed, and laid bare by sunrise. I ended the call and walked into the darkness, the snow crunching beneath my boots. They thought they had just bought my absence and my silence. They had actually just funded their own absolute destruction. 48 hours is a lifetime when you are waiting for actionable intelligence. In my career, I learned that patience is not the absence of action, but the absolute control of it. I did not pace the hardwood floors of my penthouse. I did not stare out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the frozen Chicago skyline, wondering what my daughter was enduring. I sat at my heavy oak dining table drinking black coffee and waited for the network I had built over 40 years to do exactly what it was designed to do. At exactly 0600 hours on Monday morning, the secure line on my desk vibrated with a single sustained hum. Michael was ready. 30 minutes later, Michael walked through the heavy mahogany doors of my residence. He wore a sharp gray suit that effectively hid the sidearm holstered beneath his jacket. He moved with the silent, economical precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life operating in the shadows. He did not offer a casual greeting or a sympathetic smile. He knew better. He placed a thick leather-bound dossier on the center of the table. He stood at attention, his posture perfectly rigid, and delivered his verbal briefing with surgical efficiency. He stated that the financial architecture of Stephen and his son was a complete fabrication. He told me the entire family was bleeding out from catastrophic liabilities. I dismissed him with a brief nod. The heavy doors clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone with the truth. I opened the dossier. The crisp white pages were filled with routing numbers, shell company profiles, and offshore wire transfer logs. I did not read them as an angry father whose daughter had been insulted. Emotion is a fatal liability in a combat zone. Anger narrows your peripheral vision, and pride makes your strategy sloppy. I read the detailed financial breakdown with the exact same cold detachment I used when reviewing satellite imagery of enemy troop movements in the green zone of Baghdad. Back then, a single miscalculated coordinate meant heavy casualties in body bags. Today, a missed detail in these bank statements meant my daughter would be systematically destroyed by financial parasites. I compartmentalized my paternal rage. I locked it away in a dark corner of my mind and became a machine processing hostile data. The first section of the dossier dismantled the pristine, arrogant life of Stephen and Patricia. It was a spectacular illusion built on a foundation of rotting wood. Stephen did not possess generational wealth or infinite corporate power. He possessed an ocean of suffocating debt. His exclusive country club memberships were 6 months in arrears. The luxury vehicles parked in his sprawling driveway were leased under predatory interest rates that he could no longer afford to maintain. The summer home in the Hamptons he had boasted about so loudly at the restaurant was currently facing aggressive foreclosure proceedings. He was not a king surveying his empire. He was a desperate, drowning man clawing at anyone within reach to stay afloat. The next section traced the origin of the $10,000 cashier's check he had slid across the table to me. This was where the enemy's true cowardice was laid bare. The funds did not originate from Stephen's hollow accounts. The money had been wired through a convoluted series of domestic transfers intended to mask the original source. But Michael's cyber team had untangled the web effortlessly. The $10,000 came directly from a joint savings account bearing my daughter's name. Brian had drained Rachel's hard-earned savings and funneled the cash directly to his father, solely to finance the bribe meant to banish me from her life. They were not just insulting me. They were using my own daughter's labor to fund my exile. Brian was playing the role of a highly successful corporate executive while actively bleeding his wife dry to maintain his parents' fraudulent lifestyle. He was using Rachel as a financial human shield. It was a textbook insurgency tactic. When the enemy lacks the strength to fight you head-on, they hide behind the innocent. Brian knew his parents were facing absolute financial ruin. He had married Rachel not for love, but to secure a pristine credit score and a steady stream of exploitable income. He was a tick feeding on her stability, swelling himself on her hard work, while convincing her she needed him to survive. I turned the page, analyzing the depths of his manipulation. Brian controlled all of Rachel's access to their joint capital. He had isolated her from her own money, doling out allowances, while he transferred massive sums to prop up Stephen's failing shell companies. He had constructed a psychological prison around her, making her believe his financial dominance was a form of protection. Every time she asked a question about their dwindling accounts, he likely resorted to rage and gaslighting, breaking down her confidence until she stopped asking altogether. It was a precise, methodical destruction of a human spirit. I turned to the final tab of the dossier, seeking the full extent of the structural damage. Michael had flagged one specific document with a bright red marker. It was a digital copy of a property deed modification. I traced the black ink with my index finger, and the cold detachment I had maintained began to crack. It was rapidly replaced by a dark, terrifying clarity. Brian had not stopped at draining her liquid savings accounts. 2 weeks ago, without Rachel's knowledge or consent, he had forged her signature and secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on the home she had purchased entirely on her own before their marriage. He was liquidating her entire future to cover his family's collapsing debt. They were preparing to abandon the sinking ship, and they had tightly chained my daughter to the anchor. The revelation of the forged second mortgage required immediate tactical action. I could not simply storm into my daughter's home and lay a military forensic dossier on her kitchen table. When dealing with a hostage situation, you never make sudden movements that might spook the captor or traumatize the captive. You approach slowly and establish a secure line of communication. I picked up my phone and called Rachel. I kept my voice light and casually asked if she had time for a quick lunch away from her office. I suggested an old family-owned diner sitting right off the interstate. It was a modest place with faded vinyl booths and cheap coffee, located miles away from the upscale financial districts her husband preferred to frequent. I arrived 30 minutes early. I chose a corner booth facing the front entrance, ensuring I had a clear line of sight to the door and the parking lot. I needed to see absolutely everyone who entered the perimeter. When Rachel finally walked through the heavy glass doors, my chest tightened with a profound, heavy sorrow. The vibrant, fiercely independent young woman I had raised looked like a hollow ghost of her former self. She was wearing a thick gray sweater that looked 2 sizes too big, and her posture was completely slumped. Dark, exhausted circles shadowed her eyes. She held her purse tightly against her chest, like a physical shield, her eyes darting nervously around the diner before they finally landed on me. She slid into the booth across from me and immediately offered a weak, trembling smile that did not reach her eyes. Before I could even say hello, she started apologizing frantically for the disaster at the Christmas dinner. She stammered out rehearsed excuses, claiming that Brian was just under a massive amount of corporate pressure and that his wealthy parents were simply very particular about social appearances. I raised my hand slowly and stopped her. I told her in a soft, steady voice that she never had to apologize to me for another man's profound arrogance. The waitress came over and I ordered 2 black coffees and 2 plates of eggs and hash browns. I kept the conversation incredibly light at first. We talked about the freezing weather and I asked her about the new projects she was managing at her architectural firm. But while we spoke, I was meticulously analyzing her behavior. Her hands were shaking. Her fingers constantly twisted her gold wedding band, a nervous tic she had never displayed before she married him. She looked like a soldier, suffering from severe combat fatigue, constantly bracing for an impact she could not see coming. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and decided it was time to carefully shift the terrain of the conversation. I casually mentioned that I was looking to restructure some of my modest retirement savings. I asked her if she and Brian had a reliable financial planner she might recommend. The simple question hit my daughter like a physical blow. She physically flinched. Her eyes darted away from my face and stared intently at the salt shaker on the table. She swallowed hard and whispered that Brian handled absolutely all the money in their household. She said he preferred to keep their finances streamlined because he worked in the investment sector. She forced a hollow laugh and claimed she was just not very good with numbers anymore. I knew my daughter better than anyone on this earth. Rachel had graduated with high honors in applied mathematics before she ever pivoted to her career in architecture. She was brilliant with numbers. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so only she could hear me, and gently asked if she had direct access to her own personal savings account. The dam broke instantly. A single tear escaped and rolled down her pale cheek. She quickly reached up and wiped it away, looking around the diner in sheer panic as if she expected to be punished for crying. She leaned across the table and confessed in a trembling whisper that she did not even have the login passwords for her own bank accounts anymore. The words poured out of her in a desperate, rushed flood. She told me that whenever she asked to see their bank statements, Brian would absolutely explode. He would yell until the walls shook, accusing her of not trusting his financial expertise. He would twist the argument until she ended up apologizing for doubting him. But the nightmare did not stop there. Rachel broke down completely, burying her face in her hands as she cried quietly. She told me that large sums of money were constantly missing from her personal checking account. When she confronted Brian about the missing funds, he would calmly convince her that she had spent the money herself and simply forgotten about it. He told her she was becoming careless, financially irresponsible, and forgetful. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with an absolute crushing despair. She whispered that she honestly believed she was losing her mind. My blood ran completely cold. The forged second mortgage, the drained savings accounts, the aggressive isolation. Brian was not just stealing her money to fund his parents' fraudulent lifestyle. He was systematically destroying her perception of reality to cover his criminal tracks. I had seen this exact same psychological warfare used in enemy interrogation camps. It is a calculated process of gaslighting, designed to break a captive's sanity until they become completely dependent on their captor for the truth. He was executing this mental torture on my only child. I reached across the sticky diner table and took both of her trembling hands firmly in mine. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of panic or uncontrolled rage. I spoke with the absolute terrifying calm of a commanding officer who had just authorized a lethal, devastating strike. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and told her that she was not crazy. I told her she was brilliant, capable, and entirely sane. I told her that her mind was sharp and that she needed to trust her own instincts above everything else. I promised my daughter with every ounce of authority I possessed in this world that I was going to fix this entire situation. I promised her that she would never have to feel this kind of paralyzing fear ever again in her life. Rachel stared at me, her breath catching in her throat. For a brief second, she saw past the facade of the broke old man. She saw the unwavering certainty of a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers and dismantled entire enemy networks. She opened her mouth to ask me what I meant, but she never got the chance to speak the words. The heavy brass bell above the diner door chimed violently. Heavy, aggressive footsteps stormed across the checkered linoleum floor, moving with terrifying speed. I did not need to turn my head to know who had just breached the perimeter. Brian stepped right up to our corner booth. His face was flushed crimson with absolute, uncontrollable fury. He completely ignored my presence. He reached down, grabbed Rachel forcefully by her upper arm, and violently yanked her out of the vinyl booth. Rachel cried out in sudden pain, dropping her purse onto the dirty floor. Brian pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, screaming at the top of his lungs for the entire diner to hear. He called me a pathetic old loser and accused me of trying to poison his wife against him. He demanded that I stay away from his marriage and his family forever, tightening his cruel grip on my daughter's arm. Brian's explosive reaction at the diner ended exactly as I anticipated. Cowards always retreat to their perceived strongholds when their dominance is publicly challenged. Less than an hour after he dragged my terrified daughter out of that vinyl booth, my encrypted phone vibrated with a vitriolic text message. The massive block of text was riddled with spelling errors and aggressive punctuation, a clear indicator of his uncontrolled adrenaline and unraveling composure. He officially banned me from his property. He threatened to call the local police and have me arrested for criminal trespassing if I ever stepped foot within a 1-mile radius of their pristine suburban home. He claimed I was a toxic influence, a jealous, washed-up old man trying to poison his perfect marriage because I had nothing else to live for. He demanded I pack my pathetic bags and leave the state by Friday, or he would make good on his threat to destroy Rachel financially and emotionally. I leant back in my chair and read the unhinged message twice, completely unaffected by his hollow, frantic threats. In military strategy, when an enemy loudly announces that a specific sector is strictly off-limits, it usually means they are hiding their most critical vulnerabilities right behind that wall. Brian believed that by locking the front door and issuing a restraining order, he was securing his perimeter against a weak old man. He did not realize that I never had any intention of walking through his front door again. When a structure is rotten, you do not knock on the door to ask for entry. You simply dismantle the foundation from beneath them. I forwarded the threatening message directly to Michael. I gave him a simple, one-word directive to initiate the next phase. Proceed. Brian had made a fatal tactical error. By focusing all his paranoid energy on keeping me away from his residential address and his wife, he left his corporate flank completely exposed. Michael did not send men in dark suits to peek through office windows or dig through physical trash cans in alleyways. We do not operate like amateur private detectives looking for cheap infidelity evidence. Michael deployed a ghost team of highly specialized intelligence contractors. They bypassed the physical security of Brian's downtown investment firm and went straight into the digital architecture of his corporate network. Brian was a senior vice president, which meant his hubris convinced him his private servers were impenetrable to outside forces. He was dead wrong. By midnight, Michael's cyber division had completely bypassed his corporate firewalls without tripping a single internal alarm. They cloned his hard drives, intercepted his encrypted emails, and established a continuous mirror of his desktop activity. I sat in my quiet dining room, the only light coming from the harsh glow of my secure laptop screen, watching Brian's entire financial life unfold in real time. It was like watching a bomb being assembled by a blindfolded man. The digital paper trail was a masterclass in corporate greed and amateur hour execution. Brian was not the financial genius he pretended to be at that lavish Christmas dinner. He was a desperate, sweating man plugging holes in a rapidly sinking ship. The intercepted documents proved he was actively committing massive, undeniable wire fraud. He was siphoning lucrative corporate investment funds meant for major clients and routing them through a labyrinth of international dummy accounts to wash the origin of the money. He thought his digital tracks were clever, hiding the stolen capital in a web of fake vendor invoices and bloated consulting fees. But the final destination of the stolen money was always exactly the same. It was a failing shell company registered in Delaware, owned entirely by his arrogant father, Stephen. Brian was embezzling millions from his own firm to keep his parents from drowning in their suffocating debt. He was risking federal prison to maintain the illusion that his family belonged to the elite upper class. The sheer scale of the theft indicated that Brian and Stephen were weeks, perhaps days, away from total financial collapse. As I scrolled meticulously through the transfer logs, my eyes locked onto the primary banking conglomerate Brian was using to wash the stolen funds before they reached his father. It was First Sterling Financial. A cold, hard smile touched the corners of my mouth, the kind of smile that rarely meant anything good for the opposition. Brian chose that specific bank because of its global reputation for impenetrable client confidentiality and aggressive corporate shielding. He thought his dark secrets were buried in an unassailable digital fortress. He truly believed he was the smartest man in the room. He had absolutely no idea that after I retired from the Pentagon, I was quietly appointed to the executive board of directors for First Sterling Financial. My name was intentionally kept off the glossy public brochures for security purposes, but my authority within that institution was absolute. I oversaw the compliance divisions. I directed the internal audit protocols. I did not just have backdoor access to the accounts he was using to commit federal crimes. I literally governed the men who owned the vault. I could freeze his entire illicit operation, seize his assets, and trigger a catastrophic federal audit on his department with a single, highly classified phone call. I held his absolute destruction in the palm of my hand, and he had willingly handed me the detonator without ever realizing who he was dealing with. I reached for my phone, fully prepared to contact the bank president and cut the financial oxygen to his parents' shell company. I wanted to watch them suffocate under the weight of their own arrogance. I wanted Stephen to realize the broke old man he mocked was the architect of his total ruin. But before I could dial the secure number, my encrypted screen flashed a brilliant, pulsing red. It was a high-priority override from Michael. I opened the incoming transmission immediately. Michael had just intercepted a brand new email thread sent from Brian's private unsecured account flagged with extreme urgency. The recipient was not a corporate client or a banker. It was a disgraced, unlicensed medical practitioner operating out of a sketchy clinic 3 states over. A man known in darker circles for providing whatever paperwork you needed for the right amount of untraceable cash. Attached to the email was a highly sensitive, multi-page legal document. I opened the PDF, my blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. The cold detachment I had maintained all evening vanished, replaced by a dark, murderous clarity. It was a medical power of attorney form. Brian had meticulously forged my signature at the absolute bottom of the page. He had drafted a completely fabricated medical history, claiming I was suffering from severe aggressive dementia and violent paranoid delusions. The email outlined a clear, undeniable, and utterly terrifying plan. Brian was paying the corrupt doctor a massive cash bribe sourced directly from Rachel's drained savings account to sign a mandatory psychiatric hold. He was not just trying to banish me from the state or isolate me from my daughter anymore. My probing at the diner had panicked him. He realized I was a threat that could not simply be ignored. He was actively manufacturing the legal authority to have me forcefully seized from my apartment by state authorities strapped to a medical gurney and permanently committed to a locked psychiatric ward against my will. He planned to drug me into silence and lock me in a padded room where no one would ever believe a word I said, leaving Rachel completely defenseless and trapped in his financial nightmare forever. I knew exactly when they would come for me. Military strategy dictates that an enemy acting out of sheer desperation will always accelerate their timeline. Brian believed he had effectively neutralized me by forging my signature and paying off a disgraced clinic doctor to sign a mandatory psychiatric hold. He assumed his paperwork would move through the local municipal channels with standard bureaucratic efficiency. He expected I would be caught completely off guard in my modest apartment, surrounded by people who thought I was losing my mind. I did not spend my morning pacing the hardwood floors or looking out the window in a panic. I woke up at 0400 hours. I made my bed with sharp hospital corners. I brewed a pot of black coffee and sat at my small kitchen table. I waited with the absolute discipline of a man who had spent 4 decades anticipating enemy ambushes. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through my quiet living room. I stood up and smoothed the front of my simple gray sweater. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. A woman stood in the hallway clutching a thick clipboard against her chest. She wore a severe navy suit and had her hair pulled back into a tight bun. Flanking her were 2 large, broad-shouldered men dressed in sterile white uniforms. They were state-appointed transport orderlies. They stood with their feet planted wide and their eyes tracking my every movement, fully prepared to physically restrain an erratic, violent old man. The woman introduced herself as Ms. Barnes from the State Department of Adult Protective Services. She did not ask if she could come inside. She simply stepped forward, forcing me to step back, and signaled for the 2 massive men to follow her into my living room. She looked around my sparse, impeccably clean apartment with a mix of confusion and practiced pity. She spoke to me using a slow, loud, and incredibly condescending tone. It was the specific voice people use when they believe they are speaking to a confused toddler or a dementia patient who has completely lost their grip on reality. She told me she was there to help me. She claimed that my family was deeply concerned about my recent aggressive behavior and my rapidly deteriorating memory. She unclipped a stack of papers from her board and held them up in the air. She stated she possessed a court-certified medical directive signed by a Dr. Rollins. The document authorized my immediate involuntary transfer to a locked residential psychiatric facility for my own physical safety. She slowly explained that I needed to pack a small bag of comfortable clothes and come with the 2 gentlemen quietly. She promised they would not hurt me if I simply cooperated and accepted that my mind was failing. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a single ounce of panic, outrage, or confusion. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room. I let her finish her entire rehearsed speech. I observed the 2 orderlies shifting their weight, waiting for the paranoid outburst that Brian had undoubtedly promised them would happen. When the room fell completely silent, I gestured toward my small dining table. I politely invited Ms. Barnes to take a seat. I spoke with a deep, resonant calm that immediately halted her momentum. I told her that before she authorized these men to lay a single hand on my body, it would be in her absolute best professional interest to review a secondary medical opinion. I turned my back on the two massive orderlies displaying total fearlessness and walked over to my kitchen counter. I picked up a heavy leather-bound folder that Michael had delivered to me 2 hours prior. I walked back to the table and placed it directly over her forged medical directive. I did not slide her a note from a local neighborhood therapist. I slid her an active, federally mandated psychological evaluation. As a retired 4-star general who still retained maximum-level security clearances and sat on multiple highly classified defense advisory boards, my mental faculties were not a matter of casual guesswork. Every 6 months, I was legally required to undergo a rigorous, exhausting psychological and cognitive profiling battery administered directly by the Department of Defense. My brain was actively evaluated by the top military psychiatrists in the nation to ensure I was still fully capable of advising on global security strategies. Ms. Barnes opened the folder and studied the Department of Defense seals, the dates of the evaluations, and the signatures of the military psychiatrists who had examined me less than 6 weeks earlier. Her expression changed, but she did not abandon her professional responsibility. She asked whether she could verify the documents. "That is exactly what you should do," I said. I gave her the direct number for the Department of Defense legal liaison listed on the certification. I also placed a second document on the table, an emergency notice prepared by my attorney, challenging the authenticity of Brian's medical petition and requesting an immediate administrative stay. Ms. Barnes called her supervisor first. Then she called the federal liaison. The two orderlies remained near the door while she spoke in a low voice. I heard her confirm my identity, my active advisory clearance, the date of the cognitive evaluation, and the fact that no physician named Rollins had been authorized to examine or diagnose me. Her face tightened when the liaison informed her that the signature on Brian's power of attorney form was already under investigation. She ended the call and looked down at the transport order again. "This directive has been suspended pending verification," she said. I nodded toward the forged papers. "I recommend that you preserve the originals and document exactly who submitted them." She instructed the orderlies not to touch me. Then she photographed the filing numbers, sealed the disputed documents inside an evidence envelope, and called her department's fraud unit from my living room. Before leaving, she apologized for the attempted transport. I told her the apology mattered less than an accurate report. The three of them exited calmly, but the meaning of their retreat was unmistakable. Brian's attempt to weaponize the health system had failed, and the fraudulent petition was now creating another official trail leading directly back to him. I was left standing in the absolute silence of my apartment. I picked up the fallen chair and set it neatly back at the table. The defensive phase of my operation was officially over. Brian had played his final, most desperate card. He had attempted to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me in a cage to protect his fragile ego and his collapsing financial empire. He had weaponized the state health system to remove me from the battlefield permanently. That kind of extreme, reckless escalation told me everything I needed to know about his current corporate timeline. You do not take a risk that massive unless the alternative is absolute ruin. Brian was acting like a man who knew the executioner was already walking down the hallway. His desperation meant the walls were closing in on him much faster than I initially calculated. The corporate audit at his investment firm had to be imminent. He was bleeding cash, his parents' shell company was starving for capital, and he needed unfettered access to Rachel's remaining assets immediately to survive the incoming financial storm. He needed me out of the picture today because he intended to drain my daughter completely dry by tomorrow morning. His frantic attempt to commit me was the dying gasp of a cornered animal realizing there was nowhere left to run. I walked over to the window and looked out at the freezing Chicago streets. I watched the state transport vans speed away from the curb, disappearing rapidly into the heavy winter traffic. Brian thought he was hunting a helpless old man who would quietly surrender to a fake doctor's note. He had absolutely no idea he had just forced my hand and sealed his own fate. I pulled my encrypted satellite phone from my pocket. It was time to stop observing the enemy from a distance. It was time to annihilate his entire existence. I decided it was time to drop the hammer. In military strategy, there is a fundamental rule regarding ambushes. You never chase a desperate enemy into the wilderness. Instead, you build a golden cage, place exactly what they desire most in the very center, and leave the door wide open. They will march themselves directly into their own execution. Brian and his father Stephen were drowning in a suffocating ocean of corporate fraud and catastrophic debt. The walls were closing in on their embezzlement scheme. They did not need a minor financial victory. They needed an absolute miracle to replace the stolen corporate funds before the impending audits destroyed them. I decided to manufacture that exact miracle. I contacted a highly specialized proxy investment firm that handled the aggressive acquisition portfolios for my private defense dividends. I instructed my lead corporate litigators to construct a phantom real estate development project. It was a masterpiece of financial fiction, designed to look like the most exclusive, lucrative downtown high-rise venture of the decade. We tailored the bait with surgical precision. The financial projections, the return on investment ratios, and the buy-in requirements were calculated to perfectly match the exact dollar amounts Brian was desperately trying to wash through his father's failing shell company. My legal team sent a heavily embossed, strictly confidential invitation directly to Stephen's office. The invitation offered his shell company an exclusive ground-floor partnership in this massive commercial development. It was an invitation to sit at the table with the absolute titans of the city. For a man like Stephen, whose entire existence was predicated on the hollow illusion of wealth and elite status, this was not just a lifeline. It was a validation of his enormous ego. He and Brian swallowed the hook without a single second of hesitation. Desperate men rarely pause to question why a sudden stroke of incredible fortune has landed directly in their laps. They were too blinded by their own greed and their urgent need to cover up their wire fraud to conduct any meaningful due diligence on the proxy firm offering them the deal. They immediately accepted the invitation, scheduling an in-person meeting for the very next afternoon. The meeting was set to take place on the 54th floor of a towering glass and steel commercial high-rise, situated in the absolute heart of the financial district. It was a building that commanded respect, its lobby lined with imported marble and secured by a private detail of armed guards. Brian and Stephen arrived exactly 10 minutes early. I knew this because I was watching their every single movement in brilliant high-definition video. I was not hiding in a van on the street or listening through a planted audio bug. I was sitting comfortably in an oversized leather chair inside the sprawling penthouse suite located exactly 10 floors directly above the boardroom they were walking into. I held a cup of hot black coffee resting on my knee, staring at a wall of secure monitors streaming the live feed from the meeting room. They thought they were walking into the headquarters of a nameless, faceless global investment conglomerate. They had absolutely no idea that I personally owned the entire high-rise. I had purchased the building a decade ago through a blind trust, using a fraction of my defense consulting dividends. The security feeds, the biometric scanners, the elevators they were currently riding in, all of it belonged to the broke old man they had humiliated and tried to bribe at a Christmas dinner. I watched the live video feed as the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Brian and Stephen strutted into the room wearing their most expensive tailored suits, trying desperately to project an aura of absolute dominance and generational wealth. They were greeted by 3 of my most ruthless corporate litigators. These men were legal apex predators, dressed in sharp charcoal suits, playing the role of eager investment brokers. I zoomed the camera in on Brian's face. He was smiling broadly, shaking hands with the lawyers, but the high-definition feed revealed the absolute truth of his physical condition. A thin layer of nervous sweat gathered at his hairline. His eyes darted frantically around the opulent boardroom, taking in the sweeping, panoramic views of the city and the expensive artwork lining the walls. He was vibrating with a toxic mixture of adrenaline and sheer panic. Beside him, Stephen was overcompensating. He spoke too loudly, pulling out his chair and sitting down with exaggerated arrogance, attempting to physically dominate the space. It was the exact same pathetic posturing I had witnessed at the restaurant. But this time I was not sitting at the far end of the table. I was the architect of the entire room. The lead attorney slid a sleek, glossy presentation folder across the polished glass table. He began the pitch. He spoke smoothly, outlining a multi-million-dollar commercial zoning project that promised to triple its initial investors' capital within 18 months. He emphasized that this was a closed-door opportunity available only to a highly select group of elite corporate entities. He played directly into Stephen's massive ego, telling him that his shell company had been specifically chosen because of its unique agility and aggressive market positioning. Through the monitors, I watched Stephen puff out his chest, his posture straightening as he absorbed the manufactured praise. Brian leaned forward, his eyes locked entirely onto the projected profit margins printed in the brochure. The greed radiating from him was palpable. The trap required a specific trigger. The lead attorney paused his presentation and lowered his voice, adopting a tone of strict confidentiality. He explained that because the project was moving forward at an unprecedented speed, the required buy-in capital had to be guaranteed immediately. He stated that the initial investors needed to provide a massive upfront commitment to secure their equity in the development. He casually mentioned that the proxy firm required a demonstration of absolute liquid capital. They needed a legally binding commitment signed today to hold their place at the table. If Stephen and Brian could not guarantee the funds immediately, the firm would simply move on to the next eager investor on their highly exclusive waiting list. The threat of losing the miracle deal completely shattered Brian's remaining composure. I watched his hands begin to tremble. He looked at his father, a silent, frantic conversation passing between them. They did not have the legitimate capital to secure the deal. The only money they had access to was the massive sum Brian had embezzled from his own investment firm. The funds he had stolen from my daughter's accounts, and the cash he was actively washing through his father's failing business. To secure this phantom real estate deal, they would have to commit every single cent of their stolen liquidity. They would have to legally bind their fraudulent assets to the proxy firm. Stephen cleared his throat, attempting to sound fiercely confident. He proudly declared that liquidity was absolutely not an issue for a family of their immense stature. He assured the attorneys that they were prepared to move forward immediately. The lead litigator offered a sharp professional smile. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of preliminary legal contracts. He slid the documents across the glass table directly into Brian's sweating hands. He explained that these were binding preliminary commitments. By signing the documents, they were officially verifying their liquid assets and guaranteeing the transfer of funds within 48 hours. I leaned closer to the monitors in the penthouse. I watched Brian pull a heavy gold pen from his inner jacket pocket. He did not ask to have his own legal counsel review the paperwork. He did not read the dense fine print buried in the back pages of the contract. He was far too blinded by his own desperation and the promise of financial salvation. He flipped directly to the last page. He pressed the gold pen to the paper and eagerly signed his name, followed immediately by his father. They smiled, shaking hands with the attorneys, believing they had just saved their entire fraudulent empire. They had absolutely no idea what they had actually just signed. Buried deep within the impenetrable legal jargon of those preliminary contracts was a comprehensive, devastating financial confession. By signing those specific documents, Brian and Stephen had unknowingly bound their personal assets, waived their rights to standard corporate shielding protections, and effectively confessed in permanent legally binding ink to possessing and transferring liquid assets that perfectly matched the exact dollar amounts of the stolen corporate funds. They had just handed me a signed notarized confession to massive federal wire fraud. The snare had pulled completely tight. It was time to shatter their illusion of power. Arrogance is a highly predictable disease. When a desperate man suddenly believes he has escaped the executioner, he rarely seeks quiet gratitude. He seeks an audience. Stephen was entirely convinced that his signature on my proxy firm's contracts had secured his salvation. He thought he had outsmarted the impending federal audits and guaranteed his family a seat at the table with the corporate elite. His massive, fragile ego demanded immediate public validation. Less than 72 hours after signing his own financial death warrant, Stephen booked the grand ballroom of the most exclusive country club in Chicago. He organized a lavish, extravagant engagement party under the guise of celebrating a new business partnership. It was a grotesque display of manufactured wealth, designed solely to show his peers that he was still a kingmaker. He invited every major investor, every local politician, and every socialite he could find. He wanted the entire city to witness his triumphant return to power. I decided it was the perfect night to attend a party. I prepared for the evening with meticulous care. I did not select one of the tailored charcoal suits hanging in the secure closet of my penthouse. I reached into the back of my wardrobe and pulled out the exact same worn-out, oversized gray coat I had worn to their disastrous Christmas dinner. I put on a pair of scuffed, practical walking shoes and a simple faded sweater. In a room overflowing with imported silk and custom-tailored velvet, a cheap gray coat is not just a garment. It is a highly aggressive statement. It is a deliberate visual disruption. I drove myself to the country club, arriving just as the main reception was reaching its peak. I did not use the valet service. I parked my modest sedan near the service entrance and walked around to the grand front doors. The country club lobby was a sea of crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly in the background, while waiters in white jackets circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne. I walked past the velvet ropes and stepped directly into the main ballroom. My presence caused an immediate physical ripple through the crowd. It was like dropping a heavy stone into a perfectly calm pond. Guests dressed in thousands of dollars of haute couture physically stepped aside as I walked past them. Their conversations died mid-sentence, replaced by confused whispers and offended stares. I ignored their judgment entirely. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my eyes locked onto the far side of the room. I was scanning the perimeter for my primary target. It did not take long to locate Stephen. He was standing near the center of the dance floor, holding court with a group of wealthy banking executives. He was holding a crystal flute of champagne, gesturing wildly as he loudly boasted about the massive commercial real estate venture his company had just acquired. He was painting himself as a visionary titan of industry. Brian stood a few feet behind him, forcing a stiff smile, but his eyes were darting nervously around the room. Brian still carried the toxic, lingering fear of a man who knew he had committed federal wire fraud. I walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor, moving with deliberate, terrifying calm. The crowd parted completely, leaving a clear, open path directly to Stephen. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him. The string quartet was still playing, but the silence immediately surrounding us was absolute. Stephen paused mid-sentence. His confident, arrogant smile completely vanished. His face contorted through a rapid sequence of confusion, disbelief, and finally uncontrolled rage. He lowered his champagne glass and stared at my worn-out gray coat, as if I had dragged physical garbage into his immaculate palace. He honestly believed I was a broken, desperate beggar who had come to ruin his moment of triumph. He puffed out his chest, attempting to physically dominate the space, just as he had done in the boardroom. Stephen raised his voice, intentionally making sure all the wealthy executives surrounding him could hear every single word. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest and demanded to know how I had managed to sneak past the front doors. He turned to his peers and loudly declared that I was his pathetic, washed-up father-in-law, a man who had completely lost his mind and was now stalking his family for money. He laughed a harsh, cruel sound and mocked my cheap clothing, telling the crowd that I was a jealous old failure who could not stand to see other men succeed. He did not wait for my response. He aggressively snapped his fingers in the air and yelled for the club security to remove the trash from the ballroom. 2 massive men wearing earpieces and tailored black suits immediately broke through the crowd. They were the club's elite private security detail, hired specifically to handle unruly guests with quiet, efficient force. Stephen smirked with absolute satisfaction. He crossed his arms over his chest and loudly ordered the guards to throw me out onto the cold street. He demanded they use physical force if I refused to move, insisting that he was a premium member who paid their salaries. He expected to watch me be dragged away in complete humiliation. The head of the security detail stepped forward, reaching out to grab my shoulder. But as he closed the distance, his eyes locked onto my face. He stopped completely dead in his tracks. I recognized the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the room and the rigid discipline in his posture. He was not a standard club bouncer. He was a former military contractor, most likely Special Forces, who had transitioned to private security after his tours. He looked at the scars on my hands, the specific set of my jaw, and the cold, unwavering calm in my eyes. He recognized exactly what he was looking at. He did not see a senile old man in a cheap coat. He saw a commanding officer. The security chief immediately pulled his hands back and snapped his feet together. He assumed a perfect, rigid position of parade rest, dropping his chin in a universal sign of absolute military respect. He completely ignored Stephen. He looked directly at me and spoke in a low, deferential tone, asking if there was a problem he needed to handle on my behalf. The entire ballroom froze. The wealthy executives, the local politicians, the socialites, they all watched in sheer, stunned silence. Stephen lost his mind entirely. His face turned a deep, violent shade of crimson. He screamed at the security chief, demanding to know what he was doing. He shrieked that he was the client, that he paid the bills, and that he was ordering them to physically remove me from the building. The security chief did not even blink. He did not turn his head to look at Stephen. He remained at perfect attention, waiting strictly for my command. The humiliation radiating from Stephen was absolute. He had tried to assert his ultimate power in front of his peers, and he had been completely emasculated by his own hired guards. His illusion of dominance shattered into a million pieces on the polished hardwood floor. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice clinking in the forgotten cocktail glasses. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer Stephen a single word of explanation or anger. I maintained absolute, deafening silence. I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my worn gray coat and pulled out a simple, unsealed white envelope. I stepped forward, bypassing Stephen entirely, and walked over to a terrified waiter holding a silver tray of champagne. I gently placed the white envelope directly onto the center of the silver tray. The flap of the envelope was intentionally folded open. As it settled onto the tray, the contents slid out into the open air, for everyone in the immediate circle to see. It was the exact same $10,000 check Stephen had arrogantly thrown at me across the restaurant table months ago. The bribe he had offered to make me disappear from his life. The signature was still clear, and the amount was still perfectly legible. But the check was no longer whole. It had been meticulously and precisely torn into 4 perfectly symmetrical pieces. I turned my back on Stephen, leaving him suffocating in his own public humiliation, and walked slowly out of the ballroom. Public humiliation is a highly unpredictable variable in human behavioral psychology. When you strip a narcissist of his perceived power in front of his peers, you do not neutralize him. You simply accelerate his timeline. Brian had spent his entire adult life building a pristine facade of corporate dominance and untouchable wealth. At the engagement party, I had shattered that illusion into 4 torn pieces of paper. He was no longer the brilliant financial strategist holding court in the center of the ballroom. He was a desperate, sweating fraud who realized his enemies were already inside the gates. I knew exactly how he would react. A drowning man does not carefully plan his next swim. He thrashes violently and grabs onto the nearest floating object, willing to pull anyone else under the water just to take one more breath. For Brian, that lifeline was my daughter. The morning after the country club disaster, Brian woke up in a state of absolute frantic panic. The phantom real estate deal he had signed with my proxy firm demanded an immediate influx of liquid capital. The corporate auditors at First Sterling Financial were already quietly circling his department. He had drained his own accounts. He had emptied his parents' failing shell company. He had secretly drained Rachel's personal checking and savings accounts. There was only one source of untraceable liquidity left in his entire orbit. Rachel possessed a massive independent retirement portfolio that she had built over a decade of high-level architectural consulting. It was a secure, untouched vault of cash. Brian needed it immediately to survive the incoming financial slaughter. I sat in my secure command center, watching the live audio and video feeds Michael had established inside their suburban home. I listened as Brian paced the hardwood floors of their modern kitchen, moving with the erratic, heavy steps of a cornered predator. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen island nursing a cup of coffee. She looked exhausted, but there was a new, quiet strength in her posture. Our conversation at the diner had fundamentally changed her. She no longer believed she was losing her mind. She knew her husband was actively destroying their financial reality. She was simply waiting for the inevitable collision. Brian slammed a thick stack of printed financial documents directly onto the marble counter in front of her. He did not bother to use his charm or his manipulative sweet talk. The time for gaslighting was completely over. He ordered her to sign the papers immediately. He claimed his investment firm had discovered a revolutionary tax loophole, and he needed to legally transfer her entire retirement fund into a new joint corporate account to maximize their yields. He spoke rapidly, stumbling over his own words, sweating through his expensive dress shirt. He demanded she pick up the pen and sign on the dotted line without reading the dense legal fine print. Rachel looked down at the documents and then looked directly into his frantic eyes. She did not flinch. She did not apologize. She simply pushed the papers back across the marble counter and quietly told him no. She stated she was not moving a single dollar of her retirement savings until she had her own independent financial advisor review the transfer protocols. The single word of defiance hit Brian like a physical blow. He had spent years conditioning my daughter to blindly submit to his financial authority. He expected her to tremble and obey. Her sudden, unwavering resistance completely broke his remaining sanity. Brian lost absolute control. He swept his arm across the kitchen island, violently knocking her coffee mug onto the floor, where it shattered into dozens of sharp pieces. He stepped into her personal space, towering over her, and using his physical size to completely block her exit from the kitchen. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural snarl. He told her she was a stupid, ungrateful woman who understood absolutely nothing about the real world. He threatened to ruin her career. He threatened to freeze every single credit card she possessed. He raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger right between her eyes, aggressively backing her into the corner of the marble counter. I watched the live feed with my heart turning to absolute ice. The urge to drive to that house and physically dismantle him was overwhelming. But a commander cannot let raw emotion dictate his tactical response. I had anticipated this exact escalation. Men who rely on financial manipulation always resort to physical intimidation when their primary weapons fail. They use fear to extract compliance. I had not left my daughter unprotected in a war zone. I had deployed Michael to establish a highly trained covert security detail around her perimeter the very morning after our diner meeting. 4 elite operatives were currently sitting in an unmarked utility van parked exactly 2 houses down the street. They were monitoring the exact same audio feed I was. They were fully armed and waiting for my single command to breach the front door and neutralize the threat. Brian realized Rachel was not going to sign the papers in that exact moment. His phone began to vibrate wildly in his pocket. Most likely his father Stephen demanding updates on the required real estate capital. Brian cursed loudly, turning his back on his terrified wife. He grabbed his car keys from the counter and stormed toward the front door. He screamed over his shoulder that he had to go to the bank to handle the corporate fallout from my interference at the party. He gave her a final, devastating ultimatum. He told Rachel that she had exactly 2 hours to sign the documents. He promised her that if those papers were not fully executed by the time he returned home, there would be severe, permanent consequences for her future. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, rattling the windows of the pristine suburban house. The moment his luxury sedan sped out of the driveway and turned the corner, I gave Michael the green light. The extraction was executed with terrifying military precision. The unmarked utility van rolled into the driveway. 4 operatives in plain clothes moved swiftly and silently through the front door, using the access codes Michael's cyber team had intercepted days ago. They swept the perimeter of the house in seconds, ensuring no other threats were present. Rachel was still standing in the kitchen, staring at the shattered coffee mug on the floor. The lead operative approached her with his hands raised, showing his credentials, and quietly informed her that her father had sent them to bring her to safety. Rachel did not ask any questions. She simply nodded, grabbing her coat and her purse. The operatives helped her pack a single suitcase of essential clothing. They did not leave a single trace of their presence. They escorted my daughter out of the toxic environment and loaded her safely into the secure vehicle. Before the team departed, they executed the final phase of the extraction protocol. Michael digital operatives completely overrode the smart home security system. They remotely changed every single digital lock on the exterior doors. They scrambled the garage door frequencies and locked the electronic gates. They effectively turned Brian's pristine suburban fortress into an impenetrable vault. Within 15 minutes, the house was entirely dark and completely silent. Rachel was miles away, traveling toward a secure luxury apartment I had leased under a blind corporate trust. The location was known only to me and Michael, ensuring Brian could never track her down through standard private investigators. 2 hours later, Brian returned to his neighborhood exactly as he promised. He parked his sedan in the driveway and confidently strode up to the front door, fully expecting to find his wife broken and ready to sign away her life savings. He punched his secure code into the digital keypad. The small screen flashed a harsh red warning light indicating an invalid entry. He frowned and typed the numbers again, pushing the buttons with aggressive force. The keypad chirped a loud error tone, locking him out completely. He pulled metal keys from his pocket and shoved them into the deadbolt, only to discover the internal tumblers had been completely replaced. Brian backed away from the heavy oak door, his confusion rapidly morphing into sheer, unadulterated panic. He ran around the side of the house, pounding his fists against the locked windows and screaming his wife's name at the top of his lungs. He peered through the glass into the pristine kitchen. He saw the printed financial documents still sitting untouched on the marble counter. He saw the shattered pieces of the coffee mug he had violently knocked to the floor. But the house was completely empty. The silence inside the property was absolute and deafening. Brian stood on his manicured lawn, realizing that his financial lifeline was gone. His wife had vanished into thin air. His access to his own property had been completely severed. He was locked out, isolated, and completely out of time. My encrypted phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of my dining table. The caller identification displayed Brian's number. I let it ring 3 times before I calmly picked it up and accepted the call. I did not even have the chance to speak a single word before Brian unleashed a frantic scream of pure, unhinged adrenaline. He demanded to know where I had hidden his wife. He screamed that I had kidnapped Rachel and that he was going to call the local police to have me arrested. His voice cracked with sheer desperation as he threatened to come find me and physically beat the answers out of my old, fragile body. He threatened to burn my apartment to the ground and leave me with absolutely nothing. He yelled that Rachel belonged to him and that her retirement money was legally his property. I listened to his pathetic, chaotic threats without a single spike in my heart rate. I waited for him to run out of breath. When he finally paused to inhale, I spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority. I told him he had exactly 1 chance to resolve this entire situation before it became a permanent tragedy for his family. I gave him a specific address located in the center of downtown Chicago. I told him he needed to bring his father Stephen and his mother Patricia. I told him that if they ever wanted to see Rachel again and walk away from this mess with their lives intact, they would meet me at that exact address in exactly 2 hours. I hung up the phone before he could argue. In every successful containment operation, geography matters less than control. You choose a location where the opposition cannot intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, call in private muscle, or escape through an unguarded exit. Brian believed I was inviting him to another argument between relatives. I was not. I was directing him into a controlled federal environment where every entrance was monitored. Every conversation could be documented, and every officer in the building already possessed the authority to act. His money could not buy access there. Stephen's social connections could not remove a signed warrant. Patricia's outrage could not frighten trained federal personnel. The location would also protect Rachel. She would remain in an adjoining secured room with her attorney and Michael's protection team until the evidence had been presented and Brian was physically restrained. I was not asking the three of them to surrender voluntarily. I was arranging the conditions under which resistance would become legally useless. Once they passed through federal security, the perimeter would close behind them. All that remained was to make certain the indictments and arrest warrants were ready before they arrived. I picked up my phone again and made a completely different call. I contacted the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. His name was David, and he had served as a junior legal officer under my direct command at the Pentagon 2 decades ago. I had spent the last 40 years serving my country, and I knew how to build a case that was absolutely bulletproof. I had sent David the complete intelligence dossier earlier that morning. Michael's private investigation had given us the map, but it would not be the evidence used in court. David's office treated every file we supplied as an investigative lead rather than an authenticated exhibit. Federal prosecutors obtained emergency preservation orders for Brian's corporate email, the first sterling transaction records, the clinic's payment account, and the offshore routing data. Agents then collected the original records directly from the banks Brian's employer and the medical provider under signed subpoenas and search warrants. The independently obtained documents matched Michael's intelligence line for line. That parallel verification established a clean chain of custody. The arrest warrants did not depend on a private security contractor's methods. They rested on records lawfully recovered by federal investigators. The federal arrest warrants for wire fraud, embezzlement, and the forgery of federal security documents were officially signed by a federal judge. They were printed out and completely ready for execution. The address I gave Brian was not a neutral coffee shop or a rented corporate mediation room. It was the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse. It is a towering monolith of black steel and dark glass that dominates the Chicago skyline. It is a highly secure federal building that houses the district courts, the federal prosecutors, and the regional offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Brian was so blinded by his arrogant rage and his desperate need to regain control of Rachel's retirement money that he did not even bother to verify the address on a map. He simply typed the street numbers into his luxury sedan navigation system and drove his entire family directly toward their own annihilation. I arrived at the federal building an hour early. I did not wait in the public lobby on the ground floor. I sat comfortably in a secured observation room on the 14th floor. David sat right next to me, resting his hands on a thick folder of federal indictments. 3 armed federal marshals stood quietly near the heavy wooden door, waiting for the final command. We watched the live security camera feed streaming from the ground floor public plaza. Exactly on time, a black luxury vehicle aggressively pulled up to the curb outside the courthouse. Brian stepped out of the driver's side door, moving with erratic, frantic energy. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing weather, and his expensive tailored suit looked completely wrinkled and chaotic. Stephen and Patricia emerged from the passenger doors, looking equally furious and deeply offended. Stephen puffed out his chest and aggressively adjusted his expensive silk tie. He was trying to project his usual aura of untouchable generational wealth. Patricia carried her exclusive designer handbag like a physical shield, looking up at the massive federal building with an expression of sheer elitist disdain. She wore an expensive winter coat and large sunglasses, completely oblivious to the absolute gravity of her situation. She probably thought they were going to quickly force Rachel to sign the financial transfer documents and then go out for an expensive celebratory lunch. They honestly believed they were walking into a standard corporate mediation meeting. They thought Rachel had hired a cheap divorce lawyer operating out of a leased office space in a generic downtown building. They planned to march right into that room, slam their fists on the glass table, and bully a senile old man into total submission. They planned to threaten my daughter with their imaginary legal power and force her to sign away her entire retirement fund. They walked confidently through the heavy revolving glass doors. They completely ignored the massive federal seals etched directly into the polished marble floors beneath their feet. They bypassed the large directory boards that clearly listed the federal law enforcement agencies and the federal judges housed inside the building. Arrogance is a truly blinding disease. It completely strips a narcissistic person of their basic situational awareness. They were so consumed by their own greed and their absolute certainty of victory that they refused to see the reality of their surroundings. They approached the primary security checkpoint located in the center of the massive lobby. Federal guards dressed in dark tactical uniforms asked them to place their metal items and phones into the scanning bins. Brian loudly complained about the inconvenience. He slapped his hands against his thighs and snapped aggressively at the armed federal guards, telling them that he had an urgent private meeting and did not have time for their ridiculous bureaucratic security theater. Stephen stood right beside his son, loudly boasting to Patricia that they would crush my pathetic resistance and have Rachel's massive retirement portfolio transferred to their corporate accounts by the end of the afternoon. He promised his wife that they would be entirely free of their debts before dinner. I watched their arrogant performance on the security monitors with absolute deafening silence. The tactical trap was completely sealed. The choke point was entirely closed behind them. They had willingly marched themselves directly into the belly of the beast. They were entirely surrounded by federal law enforcement officers holding signed federal arrest warrants. Brian, Stephen, and Patricia took their final confident steps through the metal detectors, expecting to conquer a broken old man, but they were marching directly into the absolute total destruction of their entire lives. The secured executive conference chamber on the 14th floor of the Dirksen courthouse had been reserved by the United States Attorney's Office for the operation. It was not a public courtroom, but it carried the same controlled authority. A long mahogany table occupied the center of the room. Federal seals were mounted on the dark paneled walls, and the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Chicago skyline. The only entrance was monitored from the adjoining observation room. 4 members of my corporate legal team stood near the windows. Each had been cleared through federal security and was present to explain the proxy contracts, the financial damages, and the emergency asset preservation filings. David and the federal agents waited behind the adjoining doors with the signed warrants. The room was designed for one-purpose presentation: first arrest, second. Brian and his parents would be allowed to expose their demands, hear the evidence, and understand exactly how thoroughly their fraud had been documented. Then the federal authorities would act. The heavy oak doors at the entrance swung open, and the prey finally walked into the trap. Brian, Stephen, and Patricia stepped into the grand chamber, moving with an aggressive, manufactured confidence. They had arrived fully expecting to find a makeshift mediation room. They expected to find me sitting in a cheap chair, wearing my faded gray coat, trembling with fear as they bullied my daughter into signing away her retirement funds. Instead, they walked into a fortress of absolute corporate dominance. Patricia immediately wrinkled her nose, looking around the opulent space with profound confusion. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest, clearly disoriented by the sheer wealth radiating from the room. Stephen puffed out his chest and attempted to project absolute authority. He aggressively adjusted his silk tie and marched toward the center of the mahogany table. Brian followed closely behind his father, but his body language betrayed his internal panic. He was sweating profusely and his eyes darted frantically around the room, analyzing the 4 silent litigators. Stephen slammed his heavy hand down onto the polished mahogany surface. The loud smack echoed sharply through the cavernous room, but the 4 litigators did not even blink. Stephen raised his voice and demanded to know where the pathetic old man was hiding. He arrogantly announced that his time was incredibly valuable and that he had only come to finalize the transfer of his daughter-in-law's assets. He shouted that he was not going to play childish games with a senile, broken-down failure who could not accept reality. Patricia chimed in right behind him. She complained loudly about the freezing weather outside and demanded that someone bring her a cup of hot tea immediately. She stated that it was an absolute outrage that a family of their immense social stature was being forced to deal with such ridiculous bureaucratic nonsense. Brian remained completely silent. His eyes were locked onto the thick leather folders held by the attorneys. His corporate survival instincts were finally beginning to override his arrogance. He recognized the specific posture of high-level legal predators. He knew these men were not cheap municipal mediators, they were apex corporate assassins. The four litigators standing by the window were not simply hired lawyers. They were former military legal adjuncts, handpicked by Michael and myself, for their absolute ruthlessness in corporate tribunals. They operated with the exact same lethal efficiency as a frontline combat unit. They possessed every single document, every wire transfer log, and every forged signature Brian had generated over the past 3 years. They held the complete forensic anatomy of his total destruction in their hands, and they were merely waiting for my silent command to release the devastating payload. The lead attorney, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Harrison, simply gestured toward 3 empty leather chairs on the far side of the table. He did not offer them tea. He did not offer them a polite greeting. He instructed them to sit down and wait in absolute silence. Stephen turned a violent shade of red. He opened his mouth to unleash another tirade of arrogant insults. He wanted to scream that he was a titan of industry and that he would not be commanded like a common employee. Before Stephen could speak a single word, the massive double doors at the far end of the grand chamber slowly swung open. The heavy brass hinges moved without making a single sound. The entire room fell into an absolute deafening silence. I stepped across the threshold and walked into the light. I was no longer wearing the faded, oversized gray coat that they had mocked for months. I was no longer wearing the scuffed walking shoes or the cheap sweaters they had associated with my supposed poverty. I was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored midnight blue suit cut from the finest imported wool. The fabric draped perfectly over my shoulders, projecting absolute authority and uncompromising power. My shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the overhead lights with military precision. But the most devastating detail was pinned securely to my left lapel. It was a heavy, solid gold insignia, gleaming brilliantly against the dark blue fabric. It was the official insignia of a retired 4-star general of the United States military. I had spent 4 decades mastering the brutal arithmetic of warfare. I knew exactly how to dismantle hostile networks and cut off enemy supply lines until they were forced to surrender unconditionally. Brian had mistakenly believed that his white-collar corporate fraud was somehow immune to those fundamental rules of combat. He thought he could gaslight my daughter, drain her accounts, and weaponize the municipal medical system against me without suffering any catastrophic consequences. He thought the rules did not apply to him because he wore an expensive suit and hid behind a desk. He was about to learn that the battlefield does not care about social status. The battlefield only cares about who controls the high ground. I had spent weeks silently securing every single tactical advantage. I had intercepted his digital communications, uncovered his international embezzlement, and seized total control of the financial architecture he desperately needed to survive. I did not walk with the hesitant, shuffling steps of a senile old man. I walked with the perfectly measured, unyielding stride of a supreme commander inspecting a conquered battlefield. Every step I took across the dark marble floor echoed with the weight of absolute, total victory. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my shoulders pulled back. I looked directly into the eyes of the men who had tried to destroy my family. The physical shock that radiated through the room was palpable. It was as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the grand chamber. Stephen staggered backward, hitting the edge of the mahogany table, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of ash gray. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but he was completely incapable of producing a single sound. The illusion of his absolute superiority shattered into a million pieces on the floor. Patricia dropped her expensive designer handbag. It hit the marble with a dull thud, spilling her cosmetics everywhere, but she did not even look down. She stared at the gold 4-star pin on my lapel with wide, terrified eyes. She finally realized that the broken old man she had mocked at her lavish dinner parties possessed a level of power and global authority she could not even comprehend. Brian looked like a man who had just been sentenced to the electric chair. His knees buckled slightly and he had to grab the back of a leather chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. He began to hyperventilate, taking short, frantic breaths, as his eyes darted from my tailored suit to the elite attorneys surrounding the room. The desperate, fractured pieces of his failing mind finally slammed together. He realized the fatal magnitude of his catastrophic miscalculation. He had not picked a fight with a helpless, isolated grandfather. He had declared a financial war against a man who possessed the tactical capacity to annihilate his entire existence. I did not say a single word to them. I simply walked the entire length of the grand chamber, moving with slow, terrifying deliberation. I bypassed their trembling bodies, completely ignoring their presence, as if they were nothing more than dust on the floor. I reached the head of the massive mahogany table. I slowly unbuttoned my suit jacket and took my seat, pulling my chair forward with a calm, steady motion. I folded my hands together, resting them gently on the polished wood. I stared directly at Brian, letting the silence stretch out until it became a physical, crushing weight pressing down on his chest. The lead attorney, Harrison, stepped forward, moving with the precise, calculated grace of a seasoned executioner. He did not look at Stephen or Patricia. He locked his cold, professional gaze entirely onto Brian. Harrison opened his thick leather folder and placed a single sheet of heavy embossed paper directly onto the center of the mahogany table. He spoke with a deep, resonant voice that filled the entire grand chamber, commanding absolute attention. He formally welcomed Brian to the executive headquarters of the proxy investment firm. He stated that it was his professional duty to clarify the exact nature of the legal proceedings taking place today. Harrison paused for a fraction of a second, letting the tension build to an unbearable breaking point. He then gestured respectfully toward the head of the table. He announced with perfect, uncompromising clarity that it was his absolute honor to formally introduce the primary owner and the ultimate majority shareholder of the exact same investment conglomerate that Brian had just fraudulently signed his personal assets over to. He stated my full name and my military rank, echoing the words off the glass walls. Brian stared at the paper on the table and then looked up at my face. The absolute horror in his eyes was magnificent. He finally understood that the phantom real estate deal, the massive preliminary contracts, and the binding financial confessions he had eagerly signed days ago had all been authored by me. He had unwittingly handed the legal rights to his entire fraudulent empire directly to the man he had tried to forcefully commit to a psychiatric ward. The golden cage had locked permanently shut. The words spoken by the lead attorney hung in the freezing air of the grand chamber. The absolute reality of the situation crashed down on Brian with the devastating weight of a collapsing building. I watched the remaining color completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His eyes darted frantically around the massive mahogany table, looking for any possible escape route. But the elite litigators had completely sealed the perimeter. The suffocating silence was suddenly broken by a harsh, grating sound. Patricia threw her head back and let out a loud, nervous laugh. She clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest and desperately tried to maintain her manufactured social superiority. She loudly declared that this entire presentation was a pathetic, elaborate prank. She accused her son-in-law of hiring actors to play corporate lawyers because he was too much of a coward to face them in a legitimate mediation setting. She looked at Stephen, expecting him to join her arrogant dismissal, but Stephen was entirely paralyzed. He stared at the 4 solid gold stars resting on my tailored lapel, and he understood that the power standing in front of him was absolute and entirely real. I did not give Patricia the satisfaction of a verbal response. A commanding officer never argues with an unarmed, confused civilian on the active battlefield. I simply raised my right hand an inch above the polished wood. Harrison stepped forward immediately, responding to the silent tactical command. He placed a massive, heavy leather-bound dossier directly in the center of the table. The thick folder landed with a deep, resonant thud that echoed sharply off the glass walls of the secured federal conference chamber. I rested my hands on the dark leather cover and looked directly into Brian's terrified eyes. I did not raise my voice, I did not shout or display any uncontrolled emotional anger. I spoke with the chilling, uncompromising authority of a man who had commanded vast global theaters of war and ordered the total destruction of hidden enemy strongholds. I told him that his corporate siege was officially over. I opened the heavy cover of the dossier, exposing hundreds of pages of meticulously gathered forensic intelligence. The digital paper trail was complete, undeniable, and entirely legally binding. I began to systematically read the exact dates and the precise dollar amounts of every single illicit transfer he had authorized over the past 3 years. I did not rush the presentation. I wanted him to feel the excruciating pain of every single spoken syllable. I detailed the massive corporate wire fraud he had committed against his own prestigious investment firm. I read the specific international routing numbers he had used to funnel the stolen corporate funds through foreign dummy accounts. I detailed the exact forensic evidence proving his aggressive identity theft. I explained how my ghost team of cyber operatives had intercepted his encrypted emails and bypassed his secure corporate firewalls without triggering a single internal digital alarm. I watched Brian physically shrink into his oversized leather chair as I laid out the complete forensic anatomy of his vast embezzlement operation. He finally realized that I had been watching his every single move, reading his private messages, and tracking his stolen money, while he arrogantly believed he was completely untouchable. I then turned the thick page and laid out the fabricated medical power of attorney. I described the exact amount of stolen cash he had used to bribe the corrupt, unlicensed clinic doctor. I calmly explained the severe federal penalties for attempting to forcefully commit a highly classified government official to a locked psychiatric ward using forged municipal documents. The sheer volume of the undeniable evidence was entirely suffocating. I made sure to emphasize how he had systematically drained my daughter's personal savings accounts. I described the forged second mortgage he had secretly taken out on their pristine suburban home. I spoke about the psychological warfare he had actively waged against Rachel, attempting to destroy her fundamental perception of reality just to cover his criminal tracks. I told him that gaslighting a defenseless civilian was a truly cowardly act, but attempting to manipulate the federal health system to neutralize a senior military advisor was an act of profound, unprecedented stupidity. The litigators standing silently by the windows remained perfectly still, serving as quiet witnesses to his total annihilation. Brian tried to open his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, fabricated excuse or beg for mercy, but his throat was completely dry. He was choking on his own suffocating arrogance. I closed the section regarding Brian and shifted my unwavering gaze directly towards Stephen and Patricia. Patricia had completely stopped laughing. Her arrogant, rigid posture had collapsed, and she was trembling violently in her expensive chair. I opened the second half of the massive dossier. I did not afford them a single ounce of pity or mercy. I systematically exposed the absolute fragile lie of their generational wealth. I read the crushing, catastrophic debt figures securely attached to their names. I detailed the failing shell company Stephen operated in Delaware, and exposed how it had survived solely on the stolen corporate funds his son was desperately funneling to him month after month. I explained that they did not belong to the financial elite they pretended to rule. They were simply common thieves wearing expensive tailored clothing, hiding behind a mountain of unpaid bills. I watched Stephen grip the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white. He realized that the luxurious engagement party he had hosted to humiliate me was funded by stolen corporate money that was currently being tracked by ruthless federal prosecutors. I pulled the preliminary investment contracts from the very back of the dark folder. I slid the heavy documents slowly across the polished glass so Stephen could clearly see his own desperate signature shining in the harsh boardroom light. I explained with surgical legal precision exactly what he had signed. I told him that the revolutionary commercial real estate development was a complete phantom operation, constructed entirely by my proxy investment firm just for him. I explained that by eagerly signing those binding preliminary contracts, he had unknowingly surrendered his remaining personal assets, waived all standard corporate shielding protections, and confessed in legally binding ink to possessing the exact liquid assets his son had embezzled. He had essentially notarized his own financial death warrant without ever reading the fine print. I looked directly at Patricia and told her that her exclusive country club memberships, her expensive imported cars, and her pristine social standing were permanently obliterated. They were completely bankrupt and facing imminent federal indictment for actively receiving stolen corporate funds. The illusion of their absolute dominance was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the pathetic, devastating reality of their massive crimes. The atmosphere in the grand chamber was incredibly heavy with the bitter smell of absolute defeat. The three of them sat entirely frozen at the massive mahogany table, completely surrounded by the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of their own destruction. They had walked into this secure building expecting to intimidate a broken, senile old man and force my terrified daughter into signing away her entire retirement fund. They had planned to leave this mediation meeting and celebrate their ultimate victory at an expensive downtown restaurant. Instead, they were sitting in the silent, burning ruins of their entire existence. I closed the heavy leather cover of the dossier. The final resounding thud signaled the absolute end of the presentation and the end of their freedom. I calmly informed Brian that federal prosecutors were currently reviewing the identical secure copies of this exact dossier and that his arrest was simply a matter of impending bureaucratic procedure. I told him he would lose his freedom, his stolen wealth, and his false corporate reputation forever. Brian stared blindly at the closed leather folder. The impending reality of a federal prison sentence, the total permanent loss of his corporate status, and the absolute crushing humiliation of being completely outsmarted by the man he despised shattered his fragile mind. His logical survival instincts entirely failed him, replaced by a blind, unhinged, animalistic panic. He realized he had absolutely nothing left to lose in this world. He let out a desperate, guttural scream of pure rage that tore through the quiet boardroom. He violently shoved his heavy leather chair backward and lunged completely across the wide mahogany table directly toward me. His hands were outstretched, aiming for my throat in a final, pathetic attempt to inflict physical harm on the architect of his ruin. He believed my advanced age made me an easy, slow target. He had fundamentally forgotten exactly who he was dealing with. I did not panic, and I did not retreat a single inch. I relied heavily on 4 decades of ingrained lethal military combat training. I effortlessly sidestepped his chaotic, desperate charge. As his wild momentum carried him forward off balance and completely out of control, I grabbed his extended arm and applied a single, precise tactical maneuver. I twisted his own momentum against him and drove him face first directly into the hard, polished surface of the mahogany table, pinning him there with absolute, devastating force. I held Brian firmly against the polished mahogany table, applying precise military leverage to his joints. He thrashed wildly like a desperate animal caught in a steel trap, attempting to break my grip with chaotic, frantic movements. His expensive suit jacket bunched up around his shoulders, and his breath hitched in erratic, desperate gasps. I did not exert unnecessary force, but simply shifted my weight, completely neutralizing his momentum and pressing his face closer to the cold wood. The grand chamber fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. Patricia remained frozen in her oversized leather chair, her hands covering her mouth in absolute horror. Stephen stood paralyzed across the room, completely unable to comprehend how a man he considered a frail, pathetic target had just physically dominated his son in a fraction of a second. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, and my gaze locked onto the heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom. I was simply waiting for the precise tactical arrival of my reinforcements. Exactly on schedule, the heavy brass handles turned and the massive double doors swung open wide. 6 federal agents stepped over the threshold, moving with the synchronized, lethal efficiency of a highly trained tactical unit. They wore dark, tailored suits and displayed solid gold federal badges clipped securely to their belts. They did not shout or draw their weapons because they possessed the quiet, overwhelming authority of men who knew they held absolute control over the entire perimeter. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and a completely stoic expression, walked directly toward the head of the mahogany table. I slowly released my tactical hold on Brian, allowing him to slip out of my grasp and stagger back into his leather chair. Brian rubbed his shoulder, massaging the aching joint while staring at the federal agents with wide, terrified eyes. The absolute reality of his catastrophic situation was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. He was no longer dealing with angry proxy investors or corporate compliance lawyers. He was facing the full, devastating weight of the United States justice system. I released Brian and stepped away from the table as the agents took control of him. David handed the lead agent the authenticated federal evidence packet. It contained the bank records, the original transaction logs recovered under subpoena, the clinic payment trail, the forged medical documents, and the signed proxy contracts. Every exhibit had already been indexed and entered into the federal case file. The lead agent compared Brian's identity with the arrest warrant, and then looked toward Stephen and Patricia. The financial records independently confirm the transfers described in the indictment, he said. I placed the original forged power of attorney document on top of the packet. This is the instrument he attempted to use against me, I said. The clinic's records identify the payment and the person who ordered the filing. The agent sealed the document inside an evidence sleeve. Nothing more needed to be explained. Brian had already heard the case against him. The federal government was now there to execute it. Stephen suddenly found his voice, completely breaking the heavy silence with a desperate, pathetic outburst. He violently slammed his hands onto the glass table and loudly declared that this entire operation was an illegal, elaborate setup. He puffed out his chest, attempting to desperately summon the ghost of his former manufactured authority. He frantically threatened the federal agents, claiming he had incredibly powerful personal connections throughout the city and the state. He loudly boasted about playing golf with senior federal judges and personally funding the political campaigns of aggressive district attorneys. He arrogantly promised his trembling wife that he would make one single phone call and have all these ridiculous charges completely erased before dinner. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and swore he would use his elite network to bury me in endless, suffocating legal battles until I had absolutely nothing left to my name. I looked at Stephen with more pity than anger. The people you are threatening to call cannot erase evidence, I said. A judge cannot privately interfere with a signed warrant. A prosecutor cannot bury authenticated bank records without ending a career. Any official who accepts your request would be joining the investigation rather than stopping it. I gestured toward the federal seals on the evidence packet. Your connections are not mine, Stephen. They are simply people who understand that the law has already moved beyond your influence. His posture collapsed. For the first time, he understood the difference between social access and institutional power. The lead federal agent closed the heavy leather dossier with a loud, resounding thud and signaled silently to his team. Two large agents stepped forward and flanked Brian completely, securing his physical perimeter. The lead agent spoke with a loud, commanding voice, reciting the federal Miranda rights, echoing heavily off the tall glass walls of the boardroom. He firmly ordered Brian to stand up immediately and place his hands flat behind his back. Brian began to hyperventilate violently, shaking his head in absolute frantic denial. He looked across the table at his father, desperately begging for help. But Stephen simply stared blankly at the polished marble floor, completely broken and permanently defeated. Patricia buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the pristine illusion of her perfect, wealthy family was publicly and brutally annihilated right before her eyes. Brian slowly pushed himself out of the expensive leather chair, his legs trembling so violently he could barely support his own physical weight. He raised his hands in a pathetic, slow gesture of total surrender. The federal agent firmly grabbed his wrists and pulled them roughly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the cold steel handcuffs, locking permanently into place, echoed incredibly loudly through the grand chamber. It was the definitive, unmistakable sound of total, permanent defeat. Brian let out a broken, pathetic whimper as the heavy steel bit deeply into his pale skin. His expensive, custom-tailored suit hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame, and his arrogant, manufactured posture was entirely destroyed. He was no longer a wealthy, untouchable investment banker or a ruthless psychological manipulator. He was simply a common, terrified criminal, preparing to spend the rest of his miserable existence locked inside a sterile federal prison cell. I stood perfectly still, calmly watching the agents secure their weeping prisoner. The tactical operational phase was officially complete, but there was one final emotional element required to truly finalize his absolute destruction. I slowly turned my gaze toward the discreet adjoining door located near the back corner of the grand chamber. The polished brass handle turned slowly, and the heavy wood door opened wide. Rachel stepped gracefully out of the shadows and walked directly into the brilliant light of the corporate boardroom. She was no longer the terrified, exhausted woman I had met at the cheap roadside diner. She stood incredibly tall, her posture projecting immense, quiet, unwavering strength. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her beautiful face was completely clear of any lingering doubt or paralyzing fear. Brian looked up, and his red eyes widened in sheer, absolute shock upon seeing his wife standing safely inside the impenetrable fortress of his enemy. He opened his mouth, attempting to speak, to beg for her forgiveness, or to spin one final, desperate, pathetic lie. But Rachel did not grant him the mercy of a single spoken word. She simply stopped at the very edge of the mahogany table and looked down at her handcuffed husband. Her eyes contained absolutely no sorrow, no lingering pity, and no remaining love. She looked at the man who had tried to destroy her mind and steal her future with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The agents turned Brian toward the exit. He looked at Rachel one final time, searching her face for sympathy, hesitation, or some remaining attachment he could exploit. He found none. That was when Patricia finally broke. The absolute reality of the situation finally shattered the remaining illusions in the room. Patricia let out a sudden guttural sob that sounded exactly like a wounded animal caught in an inescapable trap. Her pristine manufactured social mask completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman who realized her entire world had just ended. She collapsed heavily onto her knees right in the middle of the corporate boardroom, her expensive designer dress pooling around her on the cold, hard floor. She completely ignored her own husband, Stephen, who was still paralyzed in his oversized leather chair, staring blankly at the far wall in total catatonic shock. Patricia crawled forward slightly, reaching her trembling hands out toward me. She completely abandoned her arrogant, elitist pride and began to desperately beg for mercy in front of everyone. She pleaded with me to stop the federal agents, to call off the ruthless corporate lawyers, and to give her broken family one more chance to survive. She swore they would find a way to pay back every single dollar they had stolen from my daughter. She promised they would work for the rest of their lives to make things right if I would just let her son go free. I looked down at Patricia without sympathy. "This is no longer a question of whether you intend to repay anyone," I said. "The court has already taken control of that decision." Harrison placed a stamped federal order on the table. The proxy contracts had not magically transferred every possession they owned to me. They had provided the written admissions and asset disclosures that allowed federal prosecutors to trace the stolen funds. Using those disclosures, David's office had obtained an emergency asset preservation order and the appointment of an independent receiver. The receiver now controlled Stephen's shell company, the accounts funded by Brian's transfers, and every asset purchased or maintained with the stolen money. No property could be sold, moved, concealed, or pledged without court approval. Their leased vehicles were being recovered because the payments had stopped. Their mansion lease was being terminated because it had been funded through the fraudulent company. Their remaining accounts were frozen pending a restitution hearing. The receiver will determine what belongs to legitimate creditors, what belongs to Rachel, and what must remain available for victim restitution, I said. You will not control that process. Patricia looked toward Stephen. For the first time, he did not pretend he had a solution. They had not lost every personal belonging in a single instant, but they had lost control of the financial system that supported their manufactured lives. Their remaining clothes and personal effects could not preserve the illusion once the accounts, vehicles, memberships, and corporate assets were gone. Patricia's voice dropped to a whisper. How are we supposed to get home? Patricia buried her face in her hands and sobbed uncontrollably, her cries echoing loudly through the secured federal conference chamber. She realized that the lavish engagement party she had thrown to humiliate me was the absolute final moments of her high society life. She looked up at me, her makeup completely ruined and her face red with absolute panic. She whispered in a broken, pathetic voice that they had absolutely no money left to even hire a taxi to take them back to their neighborhood. She begged me to show just a small fraction of the humanity she had completely denied me for years. She claimed they would freeze on the city streets if they were thrown out of the building right now. I maintained absolute deafening silence for a long moment, letting her desperate pleas hang in the freezing air of the grand chamber. I reached my right hand slowly into the inner pocket of my pristine midnight blue suit. I did not pull out a legal document or a phone. I pulled out a crisp green $20 bill. I held the small piece of paper between my fingers, holding it up so the harsh overhead boardroom lights illuminated the numbers. I looked directly into Patricia's tear-filled eyes and reminded her of that lavish, disastrous Christmas dinner months ago. I reminded her of the exact moment she had looked at my faded, oversized gray coat with pure elitist disgust. I reminded her how she had arrogantly shoved a $20 bill into my hand, telling me to go get my cheap clothes dry cleaned so I would not embarrass her wealthy family anymore. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke cut through her fragile ego like a surgical blade. I told her that arrogance is a highly predictable disease that always ends in absolute total ruin. I let go of the crisp $20 bill. It fluttered slowly through the silent air of the boardroom and landed gently on the dark, polished marble floor right next to her trembling hands. I told Patricia she should pick up the money and use it to pay for 2 tickets on the city public transit bus. I told her the bus was the only form of transportation her family would ever be able to afford for the rest of their miserable lives. The tactical operation was officially over. I turned my gaze toward the lead federal agent and gave a single, silent nod. The agents firmly grabbed Brian by his arms and physically hauled him out of his leather chair. Brian did not fight back or scream anymore. His spirit was completely shattered, and his arrogant facade was permanently destroyed. He dragged his expensive shoes across the marble floor as they marched him toward the heavy oak double doors, taking him away to a sterile federal holding cell where he belonged. Rachel watched him leave without blinking, finally completely free from his toxic, manipulative shadow. Harrison signaled to the federal security officers waiting silently by the floor-to-ceiling windows. 2 massive guards stepped forward and approached Stephen and Patricia. Stephen finally blinked, slowly rising from his chair like a broken mechanical toy, completely unable to process the absolute devastation of his empire. The security guards grabbed Stephen and Patricia firmly by their shoulders. They did not offer them any gentle treatment or respectful distance. They aggressively marched the completely ruined couple toward the exit of the grand chamber. Patricia clutched the single $20 bill in her trembling hand, sobbing loudly as she was forcefully escorted out of the federal courthouse. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a loud, resounding thud, sealing their total legal and financial annihilation. They were thrown out onto the freezing Chicago streets, utterly destitute, permanently disgraced, and publicly ruined, exactly as I had planned. The architecture of total victory does not require loud celebrations or expensive champagne. I sat alone in the quiet sanctuary of my study long before the sun began to rise over the freezing Chicago skyline. I held a simple ceramic mug of black coffee, feeling the dark, comforting heat radiate through my palms. I did not gloat, and I did not smile. In my 4 decades of commanding active military theaters, I had learned a fundamental truth about warfare. True victory is a solemn experience. It is the quiet, absolute neutralization of a hostile threat. I turned on the small television resting on the corner of my solid mahogany desk and watched the local morning news broadcast. The lead story broke across the screen with devastating, uncompromising clarity. A prominent downtown investment banker had been officially arrested by federal agents on massive charges of corporate embezzlement, identity theft, and international wire fraud. The television displayed a harsh, high-definition photograph of Brian being escorted out of my luxury corporate high-rise wearing heavy steel handcuffs. His expensive, custom-tailored suit looked completely ridiculous against the grim reality of the armed federal agents firmly securing his perimeter. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bitter coffee and simply watched the screen. The mission was completely accomplished. The tactical operation to secure my daughter's future and entirely dismantle the psychological terrorists who had tormented her was a total, unquestionable success. The blast radius of a federal indictment is completely unforgiving. It does not merely destroy the primary target, but violently incinerates everyone standing in their immediate social proximity. The news of Brian's criminal empire completely collapsing spread through Stephen and Patricia elite social circles faster than a catastrophic forest fire. Patricia had spent years meticulously cultivating relationships with wealthy downtown socialites, hosting lavish charity galas, and positioning her fragile family as the absolute pinnacle of generational wealth. By noon, that carefully constructed illusion was reduced to worthless ashes. Patricia sat in the grand living room of her sprawling suburban mansion, frantically calling her supposed friends. She desperately needed to spin the narrative to claim that the arrest was a massive bureaucratic misunderstanding and secure her position in the social hierarchy. She dialed the president of her exclusive country club, but the call went straight to a generic, automated voicemail. She frantically called the wealthy women who had attended her lavish engagement dinner parties, but every single phone line suddenly went dead. The social elite are incredibly ruthless when it comes to their own self-preservation. The exact moment the federal government publicly labels a family as toxic, the wealthy immediately sever all ties to protect their own pristine reputations. Patricia and Stephen were entirely ostracized in a matter of hours. They became total social ghosts, completely erased from the privileged world they desperately worshipped. The final, devastating physical blow arrived later that same afternoon. Stephen was pacing frantically across the imported Persian rugs, attempting to salvage his completely liquidated shell company, when the heavy brass knocker on their front door echoed loudly through the silent mansion. Stephen yanked the door open, fully expecting to find a sympathetic, wealthy neighbor, or perhaps a confused delivery driver. Instead, he found two armed county sheriffs standing next to a stern, professional property management representative. The representative did not offer a polite greeting or a sympathetic smile. He handed Stephen a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, formal paper. He calmly explained that the massive monthly lease on the suburban estate had been secretly paid using stolen corporate funds, strictly funneled from Brian's fraudulent accounts. Because those specific funds had been legally seized by federal prosecutors earlier that morning, the property lease was immediately and completely voided. Stephen turned a violent shade of red and tried to argue. He raised his voice, attempting to use his manufactured corporate authority to intimidate the armed officers. He demanded more time, claiming he was a highly respected businessman and that this sudden eviction was a grotesque, illegal violation of his rights. The sheriffs simply rested their hands heavily on their duty belts and instructed him to vacate the premises immediately or face physical removal. Patricia watched in absolute paralyzing horror as professional property crews began systematically carrying her expensive leased furniture right out the front door. The beautiful antique vases, the grand piano, and the imported leather sofas were unceremoniously loaded into waiting moving trucks. They were completely stripped of the lavish manufactured lifestyle they had actively used to humiliate me and my daughter for months. Patricia collapsed heavily onto the front concrete steps of the massive estate, clutching her designer handbag against her chest as the harsh reality finally broke her fragile spirit. She watched her neighbors, the exact same people she had arrogantly looked down upon for years, standing on their manicured lawns and quietly watching the humiliating spectacle. There was absolutely no pity in their eyes, only a cold, silent judgment. Stephen stood next to his weeping wife, completely paralyzed and entirely defeated. His pockets were entirely empty. His bank accounts were frozen by strict federal mandate. The phantom real estate contracts he had eagerly signed days ago had successfully liquidated every single remaining asset attached to his name. They were left sitting on the freezing concrete driveway, possessing absolutely nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs. The golden empire of lies was permanently, completely dead. Miles away from the shattered ruins of his parents' suburban illusion, Brian sat shivering violently in a sterile federal holding cell. The stark fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows against the cold concrete walls. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored midnight blue suit or his expensive Italian leather shoes. He was wearing an oversized, scratchy orange jumpsuit that clearly marked him as property of the United States justice system. The heavy steel door of his cell had slammed shut hours ago, with a deafening finality completely separating him from the privileged, untouchable world he used to control. The absolute crushing silence of the federal lockup was terrifying. There were no corporate assistants to bring him hot coffee. There were no expensive, aggressive lawyers rushing to his aid because his frozen bank accounts could not retain their massive legal fees. He was entirely alone, completely surrounded by the devastating permanent consequences of his own boundless arrogance. His mind raced frantically, attempting to find a single tactical loophole or a hidden legal escape route. But my trap had been constructed with flawless military precision. Every single stolen dollar had been meticulously tracked. Every forged document had been thoroughly authenticated by ruthless federal prosecutors. The reality of a decades-long prison sentence settled heavily onto his chest, making it difficult for him to draw a full breath. A federal guard finally approached the heavy steel bars of the holding cell, carrying a simple, wired telephone. He announced in a flat, mechanical voice that Brian was officially permitted to make one single, unmonitored phone call before his preliminary bail hearing. Brian grabbed the heavy plastic receiver with violently trembling hands. His corporate survival instincts were completely gone, entirely replaced by a pathetic, desperate animal panic. He did not call his ruined parents because he knew they were entirely bankrupt and completely useless to him now. He did not call his elite business partners because he knew they had already publicly denounced him to federal authorities to save their own lucrative careers. There was only one single person left in his entire, completely shattered world who possessed a shred of genuine empathy. He dialed the familiar numbers, pressing the hard plastic buttons with frantic, desperate urgency. The line rang twice before the secure connection opened. He heard Rachel's soft, steady voice on the other end of the line. Brian pressed the receiver tightly against his ear and began to sob uncontrollably. He threw away his remaining corporate pride and desperately begged his wife for mercy. He pleaded with Rachel to speak to the federal judge to offer a glowing character reference and to swear on the official record that he was a good, loving husband who had simply made a terrible mistake. The drive to the federal detention center was long and completely silent. The barren winter trees passed by the window like gray skeletons against the pale sky. Rachel parked her simple sedan in the massive concrete parking lot and walked toward the imposing fortress of the federal lockup. The security process was incredibly degrading and designed to strip away all personal dignity, but Rachel walked through the metal detectors with her head perfectly high. The sterile concrete walls of the federal lockup were completely devoid of any warmth or humanity. The air smelled of cheap industrial cleaner and lingering heavy despair. Rachel sat perfectly still on a hard metal chair bolted securely to the gray floor. She did not fidget or look around the depressing visitation room. She stared directly at the heavy steel door, waiting for the guards to bring the prisoner in. The door finally buzzed loudly and clicked open. Brian shuffled into the harsh fluorescent light, wearing an oversized bright orange jumpsuit that completely swallowed his shrinking frame. He looked entirely pathetic. His expensive corporate haircut was completely ruined, and his face was covered in a rough, uneven stubble. The confident, arrogant investment banker who had systematically tried to destroy her sanity was completely gone, permanently replaced by a terrified, broken shell of a man. He sat down across from her, gripping the edge of the metal table with violently trembling hands. He looked at Rachel with desperate, pleading eyes, fully expecting her to offer a lifeline or a word of gentle comfort. He still arrogantly believed he could manipulate her emotions and use her innate kindness as his personal escape hatch. He fundamentally misunderstood the powerful woman sitting across from him. Rachel did not offer him a warm greeting or a sympathetic smile. She reached into her simple leather tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy formal paper. She slid the heavy stack slowly across the cold metal table, stopping right in front of his trembling hands. She spoke with a quiet, absolute authority that left absolutely no room for negotiation or pathetic argument. She informed him that these were the final divorce papers, completely severing their marriage and permanently stripping him of all access to her life, her assets, and her future. She looked directly into his terrified eyes and calmly dismantled the psychological prison he had built around her for years. She detailed the exact insidious methods he had used to gaslight her, making her doubt her own memory and her own sanity just to cover his massive financial crimes. She told him that his manipulation was a pathetic, cowardly illusion that had been entirely shattered by the brilliant light of reality. Brian opened his mouth, attempting to deploy one of his rehearsed apologies or spin another desperate, pathetic lie, but the sheer, undeniable weight of her absolute clarity silenced him completely. He finally realized that the terrified, submissive wife he had controlled was permanently dead. Rachel stood up from the metal chair, smoothing her elegant winter coat with perfect, unwavering composure. She did not wish him luck or say a final goodbye. She simply turned her back on the broken, weeping man and walked out of the sterile visitation room, moving toward the heavy exit doors with the confident, measured stride of a woman who had entirely reclaimed her own existence. The process of rebuilding a shattered life requires a completely new foundation built on solid, unyielding truth. Rachel did not return to her empty suburban house to cry or wallow in the painful, dark memories of her disastrous marriage. She drove directly to the secure luxury high-rise where her father operated his vast global network. She walked into my private executive study, moving with a new, undeniable strength that made me incredibly proud. I did not offer her empty platitudes, or treat her like a fragile civilian victim who needed to be shielded from the harsh, brutal realities of the world. A commanding officer fundamentally understands that the best way to heal a wounded soldier is to give them a new, vital mission. I walked over to my massive, solid mahogany desk and picked up a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I handed the heavy portfolio directly to my daughter and calmly explained her new global operational directive. I was placing her in absolute total control of one of my largest international philanthropic foundations. It was a massive global organization that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in private assets dedicated strictly to dismantling systemic financial abuse and protecting vulnerable, exploited populations worldwide. Rachel opened the heavy cover and looked at the complex financial architecture and the vast network of global resources now placed entirely at her disposal. She did not flinch or doubt her own intellectual capacity to manage such an immense global responsibility. Over the next several weeks, I systematically taught her the quiet, ruthless mechanics of real global power. We sat in the grand chamber for hours analyzing complex international markets and dissecting the subtle psychological profiles of elite corporate predators. I taught her how to maneuver massive funds silently across the globe without triggering a single alarm or leaving a traceable digital footprint. I showed her how to recognize the hidden aggressive intentions of greedy men and how to neutralize those specific threats before they could ever materialize. I explained that true absolute power never needs to shout or boast or throw lavish, expensive parties to prove its own existence. True power operates in the absolute quiet shadow, moving with surgical precision and devastating total efficiency. She learned how to interpret the subtle physical shifts in body language during high-stakes corporate negotiations. She learned how to weaponize total silence to make arrogant opponents incredibly uncomfortable and force them to accidentally reveal their hidden dark agendas. Rachel absorbed every single lesson with brilliant, terrifying clarity. She completely shed the fragile, anxious persona that Brian had forcefully projected onto her mind. She fully embraced her true inherent legacy as the daughter of a supreme military tactician and a master architect of global strategy. She began to direct the massive foundation with a quiet, unwavering authority that commanded absolute total respect from elite attorneys and veteran corporate directors alike. She was no longer a civilian vulnerable to the cowardly manipulation of arrogant, wealthy men. She had rapidly become a formidable, untouchable force of nature, operating with the exact same lethal, calculated grace that I had utilized to annihilate her enemies. 3 months after Brian's arrest, Michael sent me a short update regarding Stephen. The asset receivership had stripped away the last remnants of his manufactured wealth. His country club membership had been canceled, his leased vehicles had been recovered, and every former business associate had stopped returning his calls. With no savings and no professional references willing to support him, he had accepted the only job available to him. He was working as a parking valet. The irony was precise. The same country club where he had once ordered security to throw me into the street now required him to stand outside in a cheap uniform opening doors for the people whose approval he had spent his life pursuing. I did not ask Michael to arrange the humiliation. I did not need to. Stephen's own choices had placed him there. But when I learned that the club's board had requested a private meeting regarding one of my foundation's new grants, I accepted the appointment. I instructed my driver to bring the armored sedan. Stephen would not know I was coming. The drive to the prestigious downtown country club was remarkably quiet and entirely devoid of any unnecessary celebration. The thick interior walls of my custom armored black sedan completely isolated me from the freezing winds and the chaotic noise of the city streets. I sat in the spacious back seat watching the bare winter trees and the towering glass skyscrapers pass slowly by the dark-tinted windows. I did not feel a sense of arrogant triumph or uncontrolled joy. The total destruction of a hostile enemy is a necessary mechanical function of survival, and I treated the conclusion of this operation with the solemn respect it rightfully demanded. My driver maneuvered the heavy vehicle smoothly through the pristine stone gates of the exclusive club. This was the exact same establishment where Stephen had spent decades building his fraudulent social empire. It was the place where he had hosted lavish, expensive dinners to project a completely fabricated illusion of immense generational wealth to his equally arrogant peers. Now the grand building stood as a massive, silent monument to his total, permanent ruin. The dark car glided gracefully up the circular driveway and came to a slow, perfect stop directly in front of the ornate mahogany entrance doors. I looked through the thick bulletproof glass and observed the wooden valet podium standing near the main stairs. Stephen stood there, shivering violently in the biting cold wind. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting red uniform that offered absolutely no protection against the brutal Chicago winter. His physical posture was completely destroyed. The arrogant man who used to puff out his chest and boast loudly about his powerful political connections was entirely gone. He was physically shrinking, pulling his shoulders inward to conserve whatever tiny fraction of body heat he had left in his failing system. His face was weathered, heavily lined with new, deep wrinkles of permanent exhaustion and absolute despair. His hands were tucked tightly under his armpits in a pathetic, desperate attempt to keep his fingers from going completely numb. He looked exactly like a broken, forgotten relic of a collapsed regime. He saw the heavy black sedan approach, and his ingrained subservient training forced him to move forward immediately. He had absolutely no idea who was inside the dark luxury vehicle. He only knew that his daily survival depended entirely on serving the wealthy elite, who now completely owned his existence. He approached the heavy rear door with slow, aching steps, dragging his feet across the freezing pavement. I watched his trembling hand reach out and grasp the polished chrome handle with terrifying hesitation. He pulled the heavy armored door open, and the freezing winter air rushed violently into the warm, quiet cabin of my car. I stepped out onto the pristine gray asphalt, moving with smooth, calculated deliberation. I was wearing my immaculate midnight blue suit, perfectly tailored to project unwavering authority and complete dominance. My dark shoes shone with absolute military precision, reflecting the bright overhead lights of the country club entrance. Stephen kept his head bowed, looking firmly at the cold ground. He had been trained over the past few grueling weeks to never look directly into the faces of the wealthy club members he served. He began to recite a rehearsed polite greeting welcoming the anonymous premium member to the establishment. But his voice caught in his dry throat the exact moment his eyes recognized the sharp shine of my polished shoes and the precise cut of my dark trousers. I stood perfectly still, towering over his broken, trembling frame. I did not say a single word. True absolute power never requires loud, dramatic announcements or pathetic verbal boasting. Throughout my 4 decades of commanding global military operations, I had learned a fundamental truth about human conflict. I learned that the most devastating weapon you can deploy against a completely defeated enemy is total, uncompromising silence. An insult gives the enemy something to react to, and a cruel joke gives them a tiny shred of emotional validation. But absolute silence completely starves them of oxygen. It forces them to consume their own crushing shame without any external relief. I had established my absolute dominance over his entire family through pure, unyielding discipline and flawless tactical execution. I did not need to gloat about seizing his assets or liquidating his fraudulent shell companies. The cold, brutal reality of his current, pathetic existence did all the talking for me. I wanted my terrible silence to echo in his mind, louder and longer than any insult I could possibly invent. Stephen slowly raised his heavy head. Every muscle in his face contorted in sheer, absolute horror. All the remaining color drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a frozen, walking corpse. His red eyes widened in pure terror as he finally looked up at my face. He instantly realized that I had intentionally chosen this exact moment and this exact location to witness his ultimate physical and psychological degradation. He opened his dry mouth, attempting to form a word, or perhaps a desperate, pathetic plea for mercy. But no sound came out. His massive, suffocating ego had been entirely replaced by a crushing, overwhelming panic. He began to hyperventilate, taking short, frantic breaths of the freezing air. His hands shook so violently that he had to grab the edge of the heavy car door just to keep himself from collapsing directly onto the freezing pavement. He was utterly, entirely broken by the catastrophic, permanent consequences of his own boundless arrogance. I looked at him with an expression of pure, empty indifference. I did not smile, and I did not frown. I looked at him as if he were an insignificant shadow on the ground, completely unworthy of a single emotional reaction. I slowly raised my right hand and extended my arm toward his trembling chest. I held the heavy metallic keys to my armored sedan firmly between my fingers. I did not drop them into his hand, and I did not toss them. I held them perfectly still, forcing him to reach out and take them directly from me. Stephen slowly raised his shaking, freezing hand. He reached out with terrifying hesitation, as if the metal keys were burning hot to the touch. He gently took the keys from my fingers, looking back down at the ground in total, permanent defeat. He understood exactly what this silent transaction represented. He was officially my servant. He was permanently relegated to the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy he had once arrogantly claimed to rule. I turned my back on him without a single lingering glance. I buttoned my suit jacket with a smooth, calculated motion and walked directly toward the grand mahogany doors of the country club. The heavy doors were opened for me by 2 silent attendants, and I stepped into the warm, luxurious interior of the building. I left Stephen standing completely alone in the freezing wind, holding the keys to my car, utterly destitute and permanently erased from the world of power. The mission was officially completely over. The psychological terrorist who had tried to destroy my daughter and the arrogant enablers who had funded his crimes were entirely annihilated. They had been systematically stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their false social standing. I spent a brief hour inside the club, attending to a minor administrative matter, simply to solidify my undeniable presence in the building. Then I retrieved my vehicle from the broken valet and ordered my driver to take me home. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as we drove toward my secure penthouse. The deep, satisfying quiet of a total, absolute victory settled comfortably into my bones. I arrived at the massive luxury high-rise and took the private secure elevator directly to the top floor. My penthouse was a fortress of tranquility overlooking the entire dark, beautiful expanse of the city below. I walked across the dark hardwood floors and stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out at the glowing urban grid tracing the invisible lines of commerce and power that flowed endlessly through the streets. I poured myself a single glass of plain water and took a long, slow drink. The war was over, but the future was just beginning to take a brilliant new shape. My mind immediately shifted from the complete destruction of my enemies to the permanent elevation of my daughter. Rachel had proven herself to be incredibly resilient and brilliantly capable during the darkest moments of the siege. She had survived a horrific psychological war and emerged from the ashes with a terrifying, absolute clarity. She had taken full control of my largest international philanthropic foundation and transformed it into a highly efficient global machine. She moved vast resources with the exact same lethal precision that I had used to dismantle hostile corporate networks. She had fully embraced her true legacy not as a vulnerable civilian victim, but as a supreme strategist and a master architect of real power. I watched her grow stronger every single day, shedding her past fears and replacing them with unwavering, absolute authority over her own life. I walked over to my solid mahogany desk and placed my glass of water down on the polished wood. I opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio that contained the master legal documents for my entire global network. The time had finally come for me to step back into the quiet, peaceful shadows. I had spent a long, brutal lifetime building an impenetrable empire of influence and control. But I did not need to govern it forever. I pulled a silver pen from my pocket and began to carefully sign the final transition documents. I was officially preparing to transfer the absolute totality of my wealth, my global connections, and my philanthropic legacy directly to Rachel. She was no longer just my beloved daughter. She was my permanent, undeniable successor. She was entirely ready to rule the empire, and I was finally ready to rest in the quiet peace of absolute victory. The evening air was crisp and clear as Rachel and I returned to the same downtown restaurant where the conflict had begun. It was the place where Brian and his parents had tried to purchase my absence from my daughter's life, believing a $10,000 check could erase a father. It was the exact same exclusive establishment where Brian had arrogantly attempted to force my daughter into signing away her entire financial independence, while I sat silently playing the role of a pathetic, broken old man. He had chosen this specific location because he believed the intimidating, opulent environment would crush my spirit and force me into total, absolute submission. Tonight, however, the entire dynamic of the universe had been completely rewritten. I walked through the heavy polished glass doors not as a frail, forgotten grandfather, but as the supreme architect of a total tactical victory. I was no longer hiding inside the faded, oversized gray coat that had previously invited so much quiet mockery from the elitist staff. I was wearing a pristine, bespoke charcoal suit meticulously tailored to fit my exact physical dimensions. The incredibly fine, imported wool draped flawlessly over my shoulders, projecting an unmistakable aura of absolute, unyielding power. My posture was perfectly rigid, forged by 4 decades of intense military discipline and command. Every step I took across the imported hardwood floor carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a man who held total, absolute control over his surrounding environment. The atmosphere inside the restaurant was warm and filled with the low, sophisticated hum of wealthy patrons enjoying their expensive evening meals. The elegant host, standing behind the polished mahogany podium, looked up from his reservation book the exact moment we crossed the threshold. He did not look at me with the veiled, elitist disdain that I had experienced during my previous, highly calculated visit. He instantly recognized the severe, uncompromising authority radiating from my tailored presence. He quickly abandoned the long line of wealthy, impatient guests waiting near the lively bar and rushed forward to intercept us with a deep, incredibly respectful bow. He addressed me by my full formal military rank, speaking in a hushed tone of utmost absolute reverence. He did not ask us to wait a single second in the crowded lobby. He immediately grabbed two premium leather menus and guided us personally through the massive, crowded dining room. The other patrons instinctively leaned back in their expensive velvet chairs, moving out of our way as we walked past with quiet, undeniable grace. We were escorted directly to the most exclusive private booth located in the quietest and most secure corner of the establishment, entirely shielded from the noise of the main floor. The host pulled out Rachel's chair with practiced professional grace and bowed once more before silently disappearing to fetch our dedicated waiter. I took my seat across from my daughter and took a long silent moment to truly observe the profound, magnificent transformation that had taken place within her. Rachel was no longer the terrified, exhausted victim I had met at the cheap roadside diner so many grueling weeks ago. The heavy dark circles that had previously bruised the delicate skin under her beautiful eyes were completely gone, permanently erased by the absolute safety of our final victory. The fragile, anxious tremor that used to control her hands had been entirely replaced by a calm, steady, absolute grace. She wore a simple yet incredibly elegant dark winter dress that highlighted her natural, vibrant beauty and commanded quiet, immediate respect. But the most striking change was the pure, brilliant, absolute clarity shining directly in her deep eyes. She had successfully completely shed the suffocating psychological prison that Brian had systematically built around her fragile mind. She was now the supreme acting director of a massive global philanthropic foundation, wielding real, significant financial power, with the exact same lethal precision she had inherited from me. She sat across the candlelit table, radiating an immense quiet strength that made my chest swell with absolute, overwhelming fatherly pride. She was finally completely, permanently free from the toxic manipulation and the endless, terrifying gaslighting that had nearly destroyed her entire beautiful existence. Our dedicated waiter approached the private booth, moving with the silent, terrified efficiency of a man who knew he was serving absolute, untouchable royalty. He poured pristine, sparkling water into our heavy crystal glasses and took our dinner orders without daring to make any unnecessary direct eye contact. The ambient light from the small, thick candle resting in the center of the table cast a warm, peaceful, golden glow across Rachel's relaxed face. We did not speak a single word about Brian or his completely ruined, bankrupt parents. We did not waste a single breath of this beautiful, serene evening discussing the pathetic, desperate criminals who were currently rotting inside sterile federal holding cells or freezing to death in cheap, degrading valet uniforms. Their absolute, complete destruction was a finalized mechanical fact that no longer required our active attention. Rachel simply reached across the white linen tablecloth and placed her warm, incredibly steady hand gently over mine. She looked deeply into my eyes and spoke with a quiet, resonant sincerity that echoed straight into my very soul. She thanked me for stepping out of the dark, silent shadows to permanently save her life. She thanked me for believing in her sanity when she was dangerously close to losing her own brilliant mind. She expressed her profound, eternal gratitude for the ruthless, flawless military operation that had completely eradicated the hostile threats from her future. I simply nodded my head, accepting her beautiful, pure gratitude in complete, absolute, peaceful silence. The exquisite gourmet food arrived, arranged beautifully on pristine white porcelain plates, but my strategic mind was briefly occupied by a much deeper, profound philosophical reflection. I slowly ate my perfectly cooked meal while evaluating the vast, complex trajectory of my long, incredibly brutal career. I had spent 40 grueling, uncompromising years serving at the absolute highest levels of global military command. I had directed massive, heavily armed naval fleets across hostile, unpredictable oceans, and orchestrated complex tactical invasions that successfully toppled dangerous international regimes. I had sat in highly classified subterranean bunkers, advising powerful global presidents on the precise mechanical deployment of devastating strategic nuclear assets. I had earned 4 solid gold stars by mastering the terrifying, ruthless arithmetic of global warfare and securing total, absolute victory on countless violent foreign battlefields. But as I sat in this quiet, upscale restaurant, holding the warm, gentle hand of my completely safe and brilliantly restored daughter, I realized a profound, undeniable universal truth. All of those massive global campaigns and all of those historic military conquests paled entirely in comparison to the absolute magnificent triumph of this specific, intimate mission. The greatest and most important victory of my entire long existence was not achieved on a burning foreign battlefield surrounded by active hostile combatants. My supreme ultimate victory was fought entirely in the silent shadows of the civilian world, systematically protecting my own sacred, beautiful bloodline from opportunistic, greedy, destructive parasites. I had successfully deployed the full, devastating weight of my vast strategic intellect to permanently annihilate the arrogant cowards who mistakenly thought they could feed on my family. We finished our perfect, quiet meal in a comfortable, deeply satisfying, absolute silence. The terrified waiter approached with extreme professional caution and placed the final dark leather bill folder precisely on the absolute edge of the table. I did not bother to review the expensive printed numbers detailing our massive dinner cost. I simply reached deeply into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, heavy stack of crisp $100 bills. I placed a massive, overwhelming cash tip directly inside the dark leather folder, intentionally leaving an amount that would easily completely cover the waiter's rent for the next 3 consecutive months. True absolute power does not hoard its infinite resources. It distributes them with calculated absolute generosity when the final mission is completely undeniably successful. I stood up smoothly and gently helped Rachel into her elegant, warm winter coat. The entire restaurant staff formed a quiet, respectful straight line near the main exit, bowing their heads in silent, absolute reverence as we walked slowly toward the front doors. The heavy glass doors opened wide, and we stepped out into the crisp, freezing Chicago evening air. The dark, massive city skyline towered high above us, glittering beautifully with millions of brilliant electric lights. The freezing, harsh wind brushed aggressively against my face, but I felt absolutely no cold at all. The relentless, exhausting, silent war was officially, permanently over. The cowardly, greedy threat had been completely, entirely eliminated from our world. My beautiful family was completely, forever secure, and the proper, absolute balance and order of the universe was finally, flawlessly restored.